1. The ontological need, question and answer. The ontologies in Germany, Heidegger's in particular, remain effective to this day. Traces of the political past are no deterrent. Tacitly, ontology is understood as readiness to sanction a heteronymous order that need not be consciously justified, and that such interpretations are denied in higher places, as misconceptions, declines to the ontical sphere. Deficient radicalism in formulating the question serves but to enhance the dignity of their appeal. Ontology seems the more numinous the less it can be laid down indefinite contents that would give a meddlesome intellect something to latch onto. Intangibility comes to be unassailability. He who refuses to follow suit is suspect, a fellow without a spiritual fatherland, without a home in being, not so much different from the baseness for which the idealists Fichte and Schelling used to excoriate resistors to their metaphysics, in all its embattled trends, which mutually exclude each other as false versions. Ontology is apologetical, yet its effects would be unintelligible if it did not meet an emphatic need, a sign of something missed, a longing that Kant's verdict on a knowledge of the absolute should not be the end of the matter. The need was crudely but openly manifest in the early days of the neo-ontological movements, when theological sympathizers would talk of the resurrection of metaphysics. There was a touch of it in Husserl's will to replace the intentio obliqua with the intentio recta. What had delimited the cognitive possibilities in the critique of reason was nothing but the recollection of the cognitive powers themselves, a recollection which the phenomenological platform initially meant to dispense with, plainly stirring in the draft of the ontological constitution of topical fields and regions, and finally of the world as the entirety of all there is, was the will to grasp the whole without any limits being placed on its cognition. Husserl's, later turned into existentialia by the Heidegger of being and time, were to anticipate encompassingly what those regions were, up to the highest. The implication behind them was that rational drafts might predesign the structure of all the abundance of being. It was a second reprise of the old philosophies of the absolute, their first reprise having been post-Kantian idealism, yet the critical trend remained at work at the same time, though not so much as counter to dogmatic concepts. It continued as an effort in which the absolutes, now deprived of their systematic unity and delimited from each other, would no longer be posited or construed but received, accepted, and described in a posture following the lines of the positivistic scientific ideal. Once again, as for Schelling, absolute knowledge became intellectual visuality. One hoped to delete the transmissions instead of reflecting them. The nonconformist motive that philosophy need not resign itself within the bounds of unorganized, usable science recoiled into conformism. The categorical structure that had been uncritically accepted as such, as the skeleton of extant conditions, was confirmed as absolute, and the unreflective immediacy of the method lent itself to any kind of license. The critique of criticism became pre-critical, hence the mental posture of a permanent back to the absolute became what it would least like to be, and what critical truth does call it, a matter of natural history that would quickly and crudely provide the norm of adjustment. In comparison, the idealistic academic philosophy denied what will be expected of philosophy by anyone who goes in for it unprepared. That was the reverse of its Kant-enforced scientific self-responsibility. The awareness that a philosophy carried on as a specialty no longer has anything to do with the people it trains to stop asking, as futile. The only questions for whose sake they turn to it. This awareness was already stirring in German idealism. It was voiced without professional discretion by Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche challenged any kind of accord with academicism. But what the present ontologies have done under this aspect is not simply to adopt the anti-academic philosophical tradition by asking, as Paul Tillich phrased it once, about that which concerns one absolutely. They have taken the non-academic pathos and established it academically. They combined a pleasant shudder at the world's imminent end with a soothing sense of operating on solid ground, perhaps even on philologically fortified ground. Audacity, ever the prerogative of youth, knew itself covered by general agreement and by the most powerful educational institution. The movement as a whole became the opposite of what its germ seemed to promise. The treatment of relevant things relapsed into an abstractness unsurpassed by any neo-Kantian methodology. This development is inseparable from the problematics of the ontological need itself. It can no more be quenched by that sort of philosophy than it could once be quenched by the transcendental system. This is why ontology has become shrouded in vapors. In line with an older German tradition, it puts the question above the answer, where it keeps owing what it promised. It has consolingly raised failure as such to existential rank. The weight of questions in philosophy differs indeed from the weight they have in special sciences, where the solution of questions removes them, while in philosophical history their rhythm would be more that of duration and oblivion. But this does not mean that, as some keep parroting Kierkegaard, the truth lies in the questioner's existence, in his mere futile search for an answer. Rather, in philosophy the authentic question will somehow almost always include its answer. Unlike science, philosophy knows no fixed sequence of question and answer. Its question must be shaped by its experience, so as to catch up with the experience. Its answers are not given, not made, not generated. They are the recoil of the unfolded, transparent question. This is precisely what idealism would drown out in its constant endeavor to produce, to deduce, its own form and, if possible, its every content. But thought does not preserve itself as an origin, and it ought not to hide the fact that it does not generate, that it merely returns what it already has as experience. The expressive moment in thought keeps it from proceeding more mathematico and serving up problems followed by pseudo-solutions. In philosophy, words like problem and solution have a mendacious ring because they postulate the thought's independence from thinking precisely where thinking and the thought transmit each other. Only the truth can really be philosophically understood. Our fulfilling concurrence in the judgment in which we understand something is the same as a decision about true or false. If we do not personally judge the stringency or non-stringency of a theorem, we do not understand it. The theorem's claim of such stringency is its own content of meaning, the very thing that is to be understood. This distinguishes the relation of understanding and judgment from the usual order of time. The fact that we can no more understand without judging than we can judge without understanding invalidates the schema that the solution is the judgment and the problem is only the question, based on understanding. What is transmitted here is the fiber of the so-called philosophical demonstration, a mode of proof that contrasts with the mathematical model, and yet that model does not simply disappear, for the stringency of a philosophical thought requires its mode of proceeding to be measured by the forms of inference. Philosophical proof is the effort to give statements a binding quality by making them commensurable with the means of discursive thinking, but it does not purely follow from that thinking. The critical reflection of such cogitative productivity is itself a philosophical content. In Hegel's case, despite the extreme enhancement of his claim to derive the non-identical from identity, the thought structure of the great logic implies the solutions and the way the problems are put, instead of presenting results after striking a balance. While Hegel's critique of analytical judgments is exacerbated to the thesis of their falseness, everything is to him an analytical judgment, a turning to and fro of the thought without citation of anything extraneous to it. It is a moment of dialectics that the new is the old, and otherness is familiarity. The connection of that moment with the identity thesis is evident, but it is not circumscribed by the thesis. Paradoxically, the more a philosophical thought yields to its experience, the closer its approach to an analytical judgment. To grow fully aware of a desideratum of cognition is mostly to achieve the cognition itself. This is the counterpart of the idealistic principle of perpetual production. That it is by no means the absolute is asserted in philosophy by doing without the traditional machinery of proof, by accentuating a knowledge that is known already. Affirmative character, the ontological need can no more guarantee its object than the agony of the starving assures them of food. But no doubts of such guarantees plague a philosophical movement once destined for better things. It was for this reason as much as for any other that it became untruthfully affirmative. Dimming the world never takes us to the lighter being, one of the categories to which fundamental ontology owes its echo, and which it therefore either denies or sublimates until they will no longer serve for any unwelcome confrontation. We can read how much they are the imprints of something missing that is not to be produced, how much they are its complementary ideology, yet the cult of being, or at least the attraction of the word as of something superior, lives by the fact that in reality, as once upon a time in epistemology, concepts denoting function have more and more replaced the concepts denoting substance. Society has become the total functional context which liberalism used to think it was. To be is to be relative to other persons and things, and to be irrelevant in oneself. This frightening fact, this dawning awareness that it may be losing its substantiality, prepares the subject to listen to avows that its unarticulated being, acquainted with that substantiality, cannot be lost, that it will survive the functional context. What the conjurers of ontological philosophizing strive, as it were, to awaken is undermined by real processes, however, by the production and reproduction of social life. The effort to justify man and being in time theoretically, as primal phenomena, cannot stay the fate of the resurrected ideas. Concepts whose substrate is historically at an end have always been duly criticized as dogmatic hypostases, even in the specifically philosophical realm, as Kant, for example, criticized the transcendence of the empirical soul, the aura of the word Dasein, in his chapter on paralogisms, and the immediate recourse to being in his chapter on the amphibolia of reflexive concepts. But the exponents of the new ontology do not make that Kantian critique their own. They do not carry it forward by reflection. Instead, they act as if that critique belonged to a rationalistic consciousness of whose flaws genuine thought had to be cleansed as in a ritual bath. Despite this, trying to hitch their wagon to critical philosophy as well, they directly impute to this philosophy an ontological content. Heidegger's reading of the anti-subjectivist and transcending element in Kant was not quite unwarranted. In the preface to the critique of pure reason, Kant does programmatically stress his objective way to pose questions, and leaves no doubt of it as he performs the deduction of pure intellectual concepts. The Copernican turn registered in conventional philosophical history does not exhaust him. The objective interest retains primacy over the subjective interest in the mere occurrence of cognition. In a dismembering of consciousness and empiricist style, by no means, however, can we equate a subjective interest with a hidden ontology. Arguing against such an equation is not only Kant's critique of rationalist ontology, which might allow for the conception of another, if need be, but the train of thought of the critique of reason itself. Following this train of thought, we find that objectivity, the objectivity of knowledge as well as that of the totality of all things known, is subjectively transmitted. It allows us to assume an in itself beyond the subject-object polarity, but it intentionally leaves this assumption so indefinite that no sort of interpretation whatsoever would be able to extract an ontology from it. If Kant meant to rescue that cosmos noticus which the turn to the subject was attacking, and if, therefore, there is an ontological element in his work, it is still an element, and not the central one. His philosophy is an attempt to accomplish the rescue by means of that which menaces what he would save, incapacitation of the subject. A fact supporting the objectivistic resuscitation of ontology would indeed be the least compatible with its idea. The fact that to a great extent the subject came to be an ideology, a screen for society's objective functional context and a palliative for the subject's suffering under society. In this sense, and not just today, the Notai has moved drastically ahead of the in Heidegger's philosophy. The fact is detailed but registered. In his hands that historical primacy becomes an ontological precedent of being pure and simple over all ontical and real things. He prudently refrained from reversing the Copernican turn, the turn to the idea, in plain view of all. He zealously set off his version of ontology from objectivism, and his anti-idealistic stand from realism, whether critical or naive. Too unquestionably, the ontological need could not be planed down to an anti-idealism along the battle lines of academic debate, and yet, of all the impulses given by that need the most enduring may have been the disavowal of idealism. The anthropocentric sense of life has been shaken. The subject in its philosophical self-reflection has, so to speak, made the centuries-old critique of geocentrism its own. This motive is more than a matter of Weltanschauung, however easy it was to exploit as a Weltanschauung. Extravagant syntheses between developments in philosophy and in the natural science are odious. Of course, they ignore the increasingly independent language of physical mathematical formulas, a language that has long ceased to be retrievable into visuality or any other categories directly commensurable to the consciousness of man. And yet, the results of recent cosmology have radiated far and wide. All notions to make the universe resemble the subject, if not indeed to derive it as positing the subject, have been relegated to a naivete comparable to that of Boeotians or paranoiacs who regard their Hamlet as the center of the world. The ground of philosophical idealism, the control of nature, has lost the certainty of its omnipotence precisely because of its immense expansion during the first half of the 20th century, also because human consciousness has limped behind, leaving the order of human affairs irrational, and finally because it took the magnitude of the attainments to let us measure their infinitesimality in comparison with the unattainable. There is a universal feeling, a universal fear, that our progress in controlling nature may increasingly help to weave the very calamity it is supposed to protect us from, that it may be weaving that second nature into which society has rankly grown. Ontology and the philosophy of being are modes of reaction in which, along with other and cruder modes, consciousness hopes to escape from that entanglement, but they contain a fatal dialectics, the truth that expels man from the center of creation and reminds him of his impotence. This same truth will, as a subjective mode of conduct, confirm the sense of impotence, cause men to identify with it, and thus reinforce the spell of the second nature. Faith in being, a dim Weltanschauung derived from critical premonitions, really degenerates into a bondage to being, as Heidegger incautiously defined it once. Feeling face to face with the cosmos, the believer clings without much ado to any kind of particular, if only it is forceful enough in convicting the subject of its weakness. The subject's readiness to cringe before the calamity that springs from the subjective context itself is the punishment for their futile wish to fly the prison of their subjectivity. The philosophical leap, the primal gesture of Kierkegaard, is the very license from which the subject dreams it may escape by its submission to being. The spell is diminished only where the subject, in Hegel's language, is involved. It is perpetuated in whatever would be the subject's downright otherness. Just as the Deus absconditus always carried some of the irrational features of mythical deities, the corny exoticism of such declarative worldviews as the astonishingly consumable Zen Buddhist one casts light upon today's restorative philosophies. Like Zen, they simulate a thinking posture which the history stored in the subjects makes impossible to assume. Restricting the mind to thoughts open and attainable at the historical stage of its experience is an element of freedom. Non-conceptual vagary represents the opposite of freedom. Doctrines which heedlessly run off from the subject of the universe, along with the philosophy of being, are more easily brought into accord with the world's hardened condition and with the chances of success in it than is the tiniest bit of self-reflection by a subject pondering upon itself and its real captivity. Being, subject, object, the popular success of ontology feeds on an illusion that the states of the intentia recta might simply be chosen by a consciousness full of nominalist and subjectivist sediments, a consciousness which self-reflection alone has made what it is. Heidegger, of course, saw through this illusion. He circumvents the alternative by way of the doctrine of being that prevails beyond intentia recta and intentia obliqua, beyond subject and object, beyond concept and entity. Being is the supreme concept, for on the lips of him who says being is the word, not being itself, and yet it is said to be privileged above all conceptuality, by virtue of moments which the thinker thinks along with the word being and which the abstractly obtained significative unity of the concept does not exhaust, presupposed by the talker being, though no longer referred to by the mature Heidegger, at least, is Husserl's doctrine of categorial visuality or essence perception. It is solely by such perception that the structure which Heidegger's philosophy ascribes to being could, in the terminology of the school, be unsealed or unveiled. Heidegger's emphatic being would be the ideal of what yields to ideation. The critique that lies in Husserl's doctrine, of a classifying logic as the significative unity of whatever the concept covers, remains in force. But Husserl wished to have his cake and eat it too. He kept his philosophy within the bounds of the division of labor and left the concept of strict science alone until his late phase, despite all of the so-called foundation questions. And yet he sought to apply the strict rules of the scientific game to whatever critique of these rules has its own meaning. What his explicitly propounded method sought to do to classifying concepts, by the mode of their cognitive ascertainment, was to imbue them with that which has classification, as the mere arrangement of given things. They cannot have, to imbue them with what they would have only by grasping the thing itself, which in Husserl's case oscillates between an instrumental thing and one contrary to the immanence of consciousness. Husserl cannot, as was customary in his lifetime, be accused of irrationalism on the ground that his categorial vision is unscientific. His work as a whole is a stand against irrationalism. But what can be held against his work is its contamination with science. Heidegger noticed this and took the step Husserl shrank from. However, in doing so he discarded the rational moment which Husserl preserved, and, more like Bergson in this respect, he tacitly followed a procedure in which the relation to the discursive concept, an inalienable element of thought, was sacrificed. At the same time he covered Bergson's weakness, his juxtaposition of two disconnected, disparate modes of cognition. Heidegger, mobilizing the alleged higher dignity of the part of categorical vision, removes the epistemological, critical question as pre-ontological, along with the question whether that part is legitimate. Discontent with the preliminary epistemological question comes to justify its outright elimination. Dogmatics simply turns into a higher truth, as against the traditional critique of dogmatics. This is the root of Heidegger's archaicism, the ambiguity of the Greek words for being, an ambiguity that dates back to the Ionians' failure to distinguish between materials, principles, and the pure essence, is not listed as a defect but as original superiority. Its mission is to heal the concept being of the wound of its conceptuality, of the split between thoughts and their content. Ontological objectivism, what appears as if it were located in the eon before the fall, however, the fall of both subjectifying and objectifying metaphysics, will turn, conticur, into a stark in itself a self. Denying subjectivity recoils into objectivism. No matter how painstakingly such thinking shuns the criticist controversy by adding the two antithetical positions alike to the loss of being, the sublimation of its concept will be a ceaseless continuance of Husserl's reductions. What is meant by being is stripped as much of all individuated existence as of all traces of rational abstraction. This being ends up in a tautology from which the subject has been evicted. But being, what is being? It is itself. 3. There is no way for being to avoid the tautology, and we do not improve it if with prudent candor we opt for it and pronounce it a pledge of profundity. Intentionally or not, every judgment, even an analytical one, as shown by Hegel, carries with it the claim to predicate something that is not simply identical with the mere concept of the subject. If it ignores this requirement, the judgment breaks the contract it has previously signed by its form. But the concept of being as handled by the new ontology cannot help breaking that contract. In this ontology, being must be defined by itself alone because it is held to be neither comprehensible in concepts, in other words, neither transmitted, nor immediately demonstrable after the model of sensory ascertainment. In lieu of any critical authority for being we get a reiteration of the mere name, the residue, the supposedly undisfigured essence. 4 is lichen of the type which the motivated thought movement had to reject. As Heidegger once pointed out against Sartre, 5 a philosophy's denial that it is metaphysics does not settle the question whether or not it is, but it does justify the suspicion that untruth may hide in the refusal to admit its metaphysical content. A new beginning at an alleged 0 point is the mask of strenuous forgetfulness, an effort to which sympathy with barbarism is not extraneous. The decay of the older ontologies, of the scholastic ones as well as of their rationalistic successors, was not a contingent change in Weltanschauung or thinking style. To believe in that change is the same historical relativism to which the ontological need used to take exception. No sympathy with Plato's enthusiasm as against Aristotle's touch of resignation to the special sciences can refute the objection that the doctrine of ideas duplicates a world of things. No plea for the blessings of order will remove the difficulties caused in Aristotelian metaphysics by the relation of and. These difficulties spring from the disjoint definitions of being and entity, which the new ontology resolutely and naively restores. Nor would a demand, however legitimate, for objective reason alone enable us to think Kant's critique of the ontological argument for God out of existence. Compared with Hylozoism, the Eleatic turn to the presently glorified concept of being was already a sort of enlightenment, something less appreciated by Heidegger. But to wipe this all out by regressing to sacred primordiality, behind the reflection of critical thought, this intention would solely circumvent philosophical compulsions which, once understood, barred the quenching of the ontological need. The will not to accept evasions, the will to learn essential things from philosophy, is deformed by answers tailored to the need, by answers that lie in twilight between the legitimate legitimate duty to provide bread, not stones, and the illegitimate conviction that there must be bread because it must be. The disappointed need that a philosophy based on the primacy of method will acquiesce in so-called preliminary questions, and that, therefore, it may possibly even feel secure as a basic science, serves only to deceive us about the fact that the preliminary questions in philosophy itself have virtually no cognitive consequences anymore. Reflections on the instrument of scientific knowledge have long ceased to touch its substance. They only touch upon what may be cognizable at all, on the validity of scientific judgments. To such reflection, any definite knowledge is subaltern, a mere constitutum, while resting its claims on its immersion in the general constitution of knowledge. The reflection leaves knowledge indifferent. The first formula to express this was Kant's famous line that the transcendental idealist is an empirical realist. 6 admirers of the critic of pure reason, and of his attempt to find reasons for experience, were deaf to this admission of bankruptcy, that the immeasurable strain of that critique was with respect to the content of experience. Encourage are only the normally functioning intellect and the corresponding view of reality. Heidegger, by the way, still opts for the normally thinking human being. 7 Few of the intramundane views and judgments of common sense are withdrawn from circulation. What Kant wished to prove, in a way that would offend all the world, was that all the world was right. This was that soul's secret joke. He wrote against the scholars and in favor of the prejudices of the people, but he wrote for scholars, and not for the people. 8 Defeatism paralyzes the specifically philosophical impulse to blast a hidden truth out from behind the idols of conventional consciousness. The chapter on Amphiboles mocks the brazen desire to know the inside of things, and this self-satisfied, manly resignation of a philosophy settling down in the external mundus sensibilis is not just the Enlightenment's no to a metaphysics that confuses the concept with its own reality. It is also the obscurantist no to every refusal to capitulate to the facade. Surviving in the ontological need is some remembrance of this greatest virtue, which critical philosophy did not so much forget as zealously eliminate in honor of the science it sought to establish, a remembrance of the will not to let thoughts be robbed of that for the sake of which men think them. Since the science is irrevocable farewell to idealistic philosophy, the successful sciences are no longer seeking to legitimize themselves otherwise than by a statement of their method. Their self-exegesis makes a causa sui of science. It accepts itself as given and thereby sanctions also its currently existing form, its division of labor, although in the long run the insufficiency of that form cannot be concealed. The intellectual sciences in particular, due to their borrowed ideal of positivity, lapse into the irrelevance and non-conceptuality of countless special investigations. The cuts between special disciplines such as sociology, economics, and history make the cognitive interest vanish in pedantically drawn, inflatedly defended trenches. Ontology recalls this, but it has become cautious enough not to try to breathe the essence into the thing by speculative thinking. The essence is to spring forth like something given, rather, in tribute to the rules of positivity, which the need would transcend. Some initiates of science expect it to be decisively supplemented by ontology without their having to touch the scientific procedures. If Heidegger, in the later phase of his philosophy, claims to rise above the traditional distinction of essence and fact, he is reflecting a justified irritation at the divergence of essential and factual sciences, of mathematical, logical and substantive disciplines, which in scientific activity thrive side by side, disconnected, although the cognitive ideal of one group would be irreconcilable with that of the other. But the antagonism between exclusive scientific criteria and the absolute claim of a doctrine of essence, or, later, of being, will not vanish at the doctrine's bidding. The doctrine opposes its counterpart abstractly, displaying the same flaws of a labor-dividing consciousness which it pretends to cure. What it enlists against science is not scientific self-reflection, nor, as some seem to think, is it something qualitatively different whose necessary motion would superimpose it on science. According to the old parable Hegel used against Schelling, the doctrine comes out of a gun. It is an addition to science, a summary disposal that effects no valid change in science itself. The doctrine's noble turn away from science finally serves only to confirm the universal rule of science, not unlike the way rationalist slogans under fascism served as a counterpoint to seemed technological activities. To pass from a critique of the sciences to their essential concerns, as to being, is to disregard in turn whatever might be of the essence in the sciences. It is a move that robs those in need of ontology of what ontology appears to give them. With a detachment from all things substantive that is more anxious than Kant's ever was, ontological philosophizing permits less unregimented insight than Schelling's idealism, or even Hegel's, especially to Buddha's heterodoxy, as dealing with mere entity and is social consciousness, which precisely in the ontologies of antiquity was inseparable from the philosophical one. In his hermeneutics, Heidegger adopts the turn against epistemology which Hegel inaugurated in the preface to Phenomenology of the Mind 9, but the reservations of transcendental philosophy against a substantive philosophy that forbids substance to cross its threshold. As merely empirical, these reservations survive, for all protestations to the contrary. In Heidegger's program to distinguish being from entity and to explicate being itself, 10 Not the last reason for the aloofness of fundamental ontology is that an ideal of the purity of being in contrast to entity, an ideal derived from the methodologization of philosophy, with Husserl as the last connecting link, will be maintained, and yet philosophizing will go on as though about matters of substance. This habitude and that purity could be reconciled only in a realm that blurs all definite distinctions, indeed every content. Scared by Scheler's weaknesses, Heidegger refuses to have the prima philosophia crassly compromised by the contingency of material things, by the transiency of the eternities of the moment, but neither will he do without the concretion originally promised by the word existence. The distinction of concept and matter is called the original sin while it perpetuates itself in the pathos of being. Not to be underestimated among the many functions of being is that, while flaunting its higher worth against entity, it simultaneously carries with it the memory of the entity from which years ago, Gunther Anders already pilloried the pseudo-concreteness of fundamental ontology, on the pseudo-concreteness of Heidegger's philosophy, Philosophical and Phenomenological Research, Volume 8, Number 3, pages 337 ff. The word concretion, most effectively occupied in German philosophy between the two world wars, was drenched with the spirit of the times. Its magic used the feature of Homer's Nicaea, when Ulysses feeds blood to the shadows to make them speak. Presumably it was not at all as an appeal to roots that blood and soil was so effective. The ironic undertone that accompanied the formula from the beginning shows a sense of the threadbareness of such archaicism at the financo-capitalistic stage of industrial production. Even Schwarzkopf snickered at the old Teutonic beards. Instead, the lure was the semblance of concreteness as non-interchangeability, as non-fungibility. This was the phantasm that rose amidst a world bound for monotony. It was a phantasm because it left the basis of the barter relationship untouched, else the longing ones would have felt even more menaced by what they called equalitarianism, by the capitalist principle of which they were unaware while taxing its opponents with it. Obsession with the concept of concreteness joined with inability to reach it in thought. The conjuring word replaced the thing. Heidegger's philosophy, of course, exploits even the pseudos of that sort of concretion, because the are undistinguishable. He proceeds, as Aristotle projected already, to substitute one for the other, according to requirement and thema probandum. Mere entity becomes non-entity, rid of the stain of being an entity. It is raised up to being, to its own pure concept. Being, on the other hand, devoid of any content that would restrict it, no longer needs to appear as a concept. It is held to be immediate-like, in other words, to be concrete. Once isolated absolutely, the two moments have no differentia specifica from each other and become interchangeable. This quid pro quo is a main feature of Heidegger's philosophy. It wants to be set off, as a memory of something precedent to differentiation and antagonism. The lure of being is as eloquent as the rustle of leaves and the wind of bad poems, but what that rustle praises will slide out of reach rather harmlessly, while in philosophy it is insisted on like a possession over which the thought that thinks it has no power. Dialectics, in which pure particularization and pure generality pass into each other, both equally indistinct, is shrouded in silence and exploited in the doctrine of being. Indistinctness makes a mythical cuirass. Deficiency equals profit. Heidegger's philosophy is like a highly developed credit system. One concept borrows from the other. The state of suspense thus created gives an ironic touch to the bearing of a philosophy that feels close enough to the soil to prefer the Germanic thinking to the foreign word philosophy. The debtor, says a faded joke, has it all over the creditor, who must depend upon the debtor's will to pay, and so, for Heidegger, blessings flow from everything he owes. That being is neither a fact nor a concept exempts it from criticism. Whatever a critic would pick on can be dismissed as a misconception. The concept borrows from the factual realm an air of solid abundance, of something not just cogitatively and unsolidly made, an air of being in itself from the mind which synthesizes it. Entity borrows the aura of being more than factual, the sanctity of transcendence, and this very structure hypostatizes itself as superior to the reflective intellect, which is accused of dissecting entity and concept with a scalpel. The very meagerness of what all this leaves in Heidegger's hands is recoined into an advantage. One of the invariants that pervade his philosophy, though never called invariants, of course, is that each substantive deficiency, each absence of a cognition, will be revalued into a sign of profundity. Involuntary abstractness is presented as a voluntary vow. Thinking, it says in the tract on Plato's doctrine of truth, is on its descent to the poverty of its provisional essence 11, as if the emptiness of the concept of being were the fruit of original monastic chastity, not of conditioning by cogitative aparius. And yet, this being which is supposed to be no concept at all, or at least a very special concept, is the aporetical concept pure and simple. 12. It transforms that which is more abstract into that which is more concrete and thus more true. Heidegger's own language confesses, in phrasings that are more critical of him than the most malevolent critic, what his asceticism is about. Thinking, by its saying, lays unobtrusive furrows into the language. They are even less obtrusive than the furrows drawn through the field by the slow-gated yeoman. 13. Despite such affectations of humility, not even theological risks will be taken. The attributes of being do indeed, like those of the absolute idea of old, resemble the traditional attributes of the deity, but the philosophy of being bewares of divine existence. The whole, however archaicist, is not to be an admission of being unmodern. Instead, it participates in modernity as an alibi of entity, of that to which being transcended, but which is to be sheltered in being just the same. No man's land. Since Schelling, substantive philosophizing has been based on the thesis of identity, unless the essence of entity, and ultimately entity itself, was a mental element reducible to subjectivity, unless concept and thing were identical on the superior level of the mind, there was no chance to proceed according to Fichte's maxim that the a priori is at the same time the a posteriori. Yet the judgment which history passed on the identity thesis upsets Heidegger's conception also, to his phenomenological maxim that the thought must bow to what is given or, finally, sent to it, as if the thought could not penetrate the conditions of such sending. The possibility of construction, of the speculative concept that was ingrained in the identity thesis, is taboo. Husserl's phenomenology already suffered from a desire to transcend epistemology under the slogan and the phenomenological fundamental consideration of ideas. Husserl expounds his method as a structure back to things. Husserl expressly described his doctrine as non-epistemological, as Heidegger later called his own doctrine non-metaphysical, but the thought of passing into subject matter was more chilling to Husserl than to any neo-Kantian of the University of Marburg who might find the infinitesimal method helpful in such a passage. Heidegger, like Husserl, sacrifices empiricism and describes to the unphilosophical factual sciences whatever would not be eidetic phenomenology, in Husserl's language. But Heidegger extends the prescription even to Husserl's, those supreme, fact-free, conceptual units of a factuality with which traces of subject matter are commingled. Being is the contraction of essences. Ontology's own consistency takes it to a no man's land. It must eliminate each a posteriori. It is not supposed to be logic either, in the sense of a doctrine of thought in a particular discipline. Each thinking step would necessarily take ontology beyond the only point where it may hope to be sufficient unto itself. In the end, there is hardly anything it would dare aver any longer, not even about being. What shows in this ontology is not so much mystical meditation as the distress of a thinking that seeks its otherness and cannot make a move without fearing to lose what it claims. Tendentially, philosophy becomes a ritualistic posture, yet there is a truth stirring in that posture as well. The truth of philosophy falling silent. Unsuccessful realism. The historic innovation of realism as a mode of mental conduct is not foreign to the philosophy of being. Realism seeks to breach of operation, the walls which thought has built around itself, to pierce the interjected layer of subjective positions that have become a second nature. There are vibrations of this in Husserl's program, and Heidegger agreed with it. 14. The performance of the subject, which establishes idealistic cognition, has the irritating quality of a dispensable ornament after idealism has declined. In this respect fundamental ontology remains, like phenomenology, an involuntary heir to positivism. 15. Heidegger's realism turns a somersault. His aim is to philosophize formlessly, so to speak, purely on the ground of things, with the result that things evaporate for him. Weary of the subjective jail of cognition, he becomes convinced that what is transcendent to subjectivity is immediate for subjectivity, without being conceptually stained by subjectivity. In analogy to such romantic currents as the later Gegenbewegung, fundamental ontology mistakes its protest against the confining and dimming subjective element for anti-romanticism. It wants to conquer subjectivity by belligerent speech, from which Heidegger does not shrink either. 16. mean, since the transmissions of our subjectivity cannot be thought out of the world, we want to return to stages of consciousness that lie before the reflection upon subjectivity and transmission. This effort fails when we believe we are, so to speak, subjectlessly clinging to the phenomenality of things, are original and neo-realistic, and at the same time doing justice to the material. We are in fact eliminating all definitions from our thought, as Kant once eliminated them from the transcendent thing in itself. Definitions would be equally offensive to us as works of mere subjective reason and as descendants of a particular entity. Contradictory desirata to collide and destroy one another, because we are neither to think speculatively, to have any thoughts that posit anything whatever, nor the other way round to admit an entity, a bit of the world, which would compromise the precedence of being. We really dare not think anything but a complete vacuum, a capital X far emptier than the ancient transcendental subjects which always carried egoity, the memory of a consciousness in being, as its unit of consciousness. This new X, absolutely ineffable and removed from all predicates, becomes the ens realism under the name of being. In the inevitability of aporetical concept formation, the philosophy of being becomes the unwilling victim of Hegel's judgment about being. It is indistinguishably one with nothingness. Heidegger did not deceive himself about this, but what should be held against existential ontology 17 is not the nihilism which the left-wing existentialists later interpreted into it, to its own horror. To be held against that ontology is its positive presentation of the downright nihility of its supreme word, on categorial vision. No matter how non-dimensional we may make being, how we may compress it into a point by the permanent exercise of caution in both directions, the procedure does have its fundamentum in categorial vision. The growing awareness of a concept reminds us that categorially constituted facts, which traditional epistemology knew as syntheses only, must always have a corresponding moment beyond the sensory. They always have something immediate about them, something resembling visuality. A simple mathematical theorem would not apply without the synthesis of the figures between which the equation is set up, and neither, this is what Kant neglects, would a synthesis be possible if the relation of elements were not in line with the synthesis, regardless of the trouble in which such a manner of speaking entangles us. According to current logic, to put it drastically, in a way that invites misunderstanding, there could be no synthesis if the two sides of the equation were not actually alike. To talk sensibly about this link apart from the cogitative synthesis is no more possible than a rational synthesis could be without that correspondence. It is a classic case of transmission, as suggested by the fact that in reflection we waver whether thought is an activity or whether the very strain of it does not make it a self-adjustment. Rather, inseparably therefrom, spontaneous thoughts are phenomena. Heidegger's stress on their phenomenal aspect against its total reduction to thought would be a salutary corrective of idealism, but his procedure is to isolate the factual moment, to conceive it, in Hegel's terminology, as abstractly as idealism conceives the synthetic moment. Hypostatized, it ceases to be a moment and comes to be what ontology in its protest against the split between concept and entity would least like it to be. It becomes a thing, and yet, its own character is genetical. The mental objectivity which Hegel taught, the product of the historic process, allows something like a visual relation to things of the mind, as some idealists, the late Rickett, for instance, were to rediscover. The more intensely our consciousness feels assured of such an evolved objectivity of the mental sphere, instead of attributing it as a projection to the contemplating subject, the closer its approach to a binding physiognomy of the mind, to a thinking which does not draw all definitions to its side, which does not disqualify its vis-a-vis, structures of the mind turn into a second immediacy. This is what the doctrine of categorial vision too naively relies upon. It confuses that second immediacy with the first immediacy. Hegel's logic of essences went much farther. It treated the essence equally as grown out of being and as independent of being, as a kind of dasein, by the demand which Husserl set forth and Heidegger tacitly adopted. On the other hand, that mental facts be purely described, that they be accepted as what they claim to be, and as nothing else. By this demand such facts are so dogmatized as if reflecting on things of the mind, rethinking them, did not turn them into something else. The unhesitant supposition is that thinking, an inalienable activity, can really have an object that will not be made a product by the mere thought. Idealism, already concerned in the concept of the purely mental fact, is thus potentially reshaped into ontology, with the substruction of purely acceptant thought. However, the phenomenological thesis to which the entire school owed its effect broke down, that phenomenology is exploring and describing things rather than thinking them up, that it is not epistemology, in short, that it does not bear the stigma of a reflecting intelligence, yet being, the arcanum of fundamental ontology, is nothing but a categorial fact, offered in alleged purity and raised to the supreme formula. To phenomenological analysis it was long known that there is something receptive about a synthesizing consciousness. What belongs together in a judgment is recognized in examples, not merely in comparisons. The immediacy of insight as such is not deniable, only its hypostasis. Primary clarity about some side of a specific object throws the clearest light upon the species, a light that dissolves the tautology of knowing nothing of the species save its definition. Without the moment of immediate insight, Hegel's line that the particular is the universal would remain pure avowal. Phenomenology, from Husserl on, has saved that line, albeit at the cost of the reflecting element that complements the line, its essence perception. However, the late Heidegger carefully shuns the slogan of the school that made him, involves contradictions that cannot be settled for the sake of peace and quiet, neither in the nominalistic direction nor in the realistic one. On the one hand, ideation has an elective affinity for ideology, for the surreptitious acquisition by indirect things of a directness vested with the authority of absolute, unimpeachable, subjectively evident being in itself. On the other hand, essence perception is our word for the physiognomic view of mental facts, a legitimate view because things of the mind are not constituted by the cognitive intentionality of consciousness but are based objectively, far beyond the individual author, on the collective life of the mind, in accordance with its immanent laws. That mental objectivity corresponds to the moment of direct vision. Pre-shaped in itself, it can be viewed like things of the senses, only, this view is no more absolute and irrefutable than our view of sensory things. Husserl, without much ado, credits both the physiognomic flash and Kant's synthetic a priori judgments with scientific necessity and generality, but what categorial vision contributes to, fallibly enough, would be the understanding of the thing itself, not its classification. The of categorial vision is its dogmatic sanctification, not its unscientific nature. Astir beneath the ideating view is the transmission that had congealed in the seeming directness of mentally given things. In this respect, essence perception is close to allegorical consciousness, as the experience of what has come into being in things which supposedly merely are. Essence perception would be the almost diametrical opposite of the end it is used for. Rather than a faithful acceptance of being, it would be its critique. Rather than a sense of the thing's identity with its concept, it would be an awareness of the break between them. What the philosophy of being boasts about, as if it were the organ of positivity pure and simple, has its truth and negativity. Heidegger's stress on being, which is not to be a mere concept, can be based upon the indissoluble content in judgments, as Husserl previously based himself on the ideal unity of the species. The positional value of such an exemplary consciousness is apt to rise historically. Gunther Anders remarked that the more socialized the world, and the more tightly the network of general definitions covers its objects, the greater will be the tendency of individual facts to be direct transparencies of their universals, and the greater the yield of view obtains precisely by micrological immersion. This, of course, is a nominalistic kind of fact directly contrary to the ontological intention, although the essence perception may unwittingly have been occasioned by it, if the procedure nonetheless keeps exposing itself to the special scientific objection, to the long since automatized charge of false or premature generalization. The fault lies not only with thought habits that have long caused men to misuse their scientific ethos, to use the principle of arranging facts modestly from outside as a rationalization of their failure to understand those facts from within. Insofar as the anticipations of the concept, the medium of exemplary thought, are confronted by empirical inquiry with concrete proof that the quasi-direct categorical view of a particular is not universal, the Husserl-Heidegger method, which avoids this test and yet flirts with a scientific language that sounds as if the test were submitted to, stands convicted of its failing. Being. It is asserted that being, precedent to each abstraction, is no concept, or at most a qualitatively eminent concept. Ignored in this assertion is the fact that no immediacy, of which Hegel's phenomenology already taught that in all its transmissions it keeps reproducing itself, is the whole of cognition. Each immediacy is a moment. No ontological draft can do without absolutizing single, culled-out moments. If cognition is an interaction of the synthetic cogitative function and that which it is to synthesize, with neither independent of the other, the direct insight stipulated by Heidegger as the sole title to a philosophy worthy of being will not succeed either, unless by the spontaneity of thought which Heidegger disdains. If there were no substantial reflection without immediacy, the immediacy would linger non-committally and arbitrarily without reflection, without the thinking, distinguishing definition of what is meant by the being that is alleged to show purely to a passive, non-thinking thought. The declarative sound of the pronouncements about things unhiding or clearing is due to the fictitious character of the claims. If the alleged primal word cannot be defined and fulfilled in thinking, if it cannot be critically confronted with its aims, the impossibility indicts all talk of being. It has not been conceived because in the indistinctness it requires it cannot be conceived, but that the philosophy of being turns the unworkability into untouchability, that it turns the exemption from the rational process into a transcendence of the reflecting intellect. This is an act of violence as desperate as it is prudent, more resolute than phenomenology, which stops halfway. Heidegger wants to break out of the immanence of consciousness, but his outbreak is an outbreak into the mirror. Blinded to the moment of synthesis in the substrate, he ignores the fact that the mind, which in Heidegger's Adorno philosophy of being confessed to identity with being, is already implied in the meaning of what it presents as the pure self who it would be confronting. Objectively, Heidegger's critique of philosophical tradition comes to run counter to its own promise. This critique tacitly ignores the subjective mind and thus necessarily the material, the factuality which any synthesis acts upon. It feigns a unity and absoluteness of what is articulated in it along these lines, and so it turns into the reverse of destruction, of the challenge to disenchant the man-made concepts. Instead of recognizing human conditions in the concepts, Heidegger's critique confuses the conditions with the mundus sensibilis. It conserves, by repetition, what it is rising against, the screening thought structures for whose removal its own program calls, on the pretext of bringing to light what underlies them. Those structures are once more, imperceptibly, turned into the in itself which a reified consciousness makes of them anyway. What pretends to crush fetishes is crushing nothing but the conditions of their recognition as fetishes. The seeming jailbreak terminates in what the flight is from. The being it flows into is, as being, which the mind transmits, is ceded to receptive vision. Philosophy converges with a flatly irrationalist view of life. A sign of irrationality would not by itself be the same as philosophical irrationalism. Irrationality is the scar which the irremovable non-identity of subject and object leaves on cognition, whose mere form of predicative judgment postulates identity. It is also the hope of withstanding the omnipotence of the subjective concept. Like the concept, however, irrationality itself remains a function of the ratio and an object of its self-criticism. What slips through the net is filtered by the net. The philosophers of irrationalism too depend on concepts, and thus on a rational element incompatible with them. One of the motives of dialectics is to cope with that which Heidegger evades by usurping a standpoint beyond the difference of subject and object, the difference that shows how inadequate the ratio is to thought. By means of reason, however, such a leap will fail. We cannot, by thinking, assume any position in which that separation of subject and object will directly vanish, for the separation is inherent in each thought. It is inherent in thinking itself. This is why Heidegger's moment of truth levels off into an irrationalist Weltanschauung. Today as in Kant's time, philosophy demands a rational critique of reason, not its banishment or abolition sense of being. When men are forbidden to think, their thinking sanctions what simply exists. The genuinely critical need of thought to awaken from the cultural phantasmagoria is trapped, channeled, steered into the wrong consciousness. The culture of its environment has broken thought of the habit to ask what all this may be, and to what end. It has enfeebled the question what it all means. A question growing in urgency as fewer people find some such sense self-evident, as it yields more and more to cultural bustle. Enthroned instead is a being thus and not otherwise of whatever may, as culture, claim to make sense. The weight of existing culture ends all insistence on the reality of its asserted meaning, or on the legitimacy of that meaning. On the other hand, fundamental ontology makes its appearance a spokesman for the pilfered interest, for all that has been forgotten. This is not the least of its reasons for being averse to epistemology, which tends to list that interest among the prejudices. Even so, fundamental ontology cannot annul epistemology at will. The doctrine of Dasein, of subjectivity, as the Royal Road to Ontology resurrects the old subjective inquiry that had been humbled by ontological pathos. The phenomenological method claims to strip the tradition of Western philosophizing of its power, but it is at home in that tradition and well aware of the fact. For its main effect, its seeming originality, it has to thank the strides of obliviousness among the ones it appeals to. Phenomenology is the source of a turn in the question what being means, or in its traditional variant, why is there anything at all? Why not nothing? The question is now ceded to the analyzers of the meaning of a word, being. What is word, or the word Dasein, might possibly mean is said to be one with the meaning of being or Dasein. An immanent cultural component such as the meaning which semanticists decipher in the various languages is treated as if it had escaped from the relativity of products as well as from the senselessness of a mere entity. This is the function of Heidegger's version of the doctrine of the primacy of language, that the sense of the word being should be the direct sense of being is bad equivocation. True, equivokes are not merely imprecise expressions. 18 The consonance of words always points to a sameness. The two meanings of meaning are entwined. Concepts, instruments of human thought, cannot make sense if sense itself is a negation. If every memory of an objective meaning meaning beyond the mechanisms of concept formation has been expelled from the concepts. Positivism, to which concepts are nothing but accidental, interchangeable tokens, took the consequence and honored truth by extirpating truth. Taking the contrary position, the philosophy of being does indeed rebuke positivism for the folly of its reason, but the unity of equivokes can be seen only through the veil of their implicit differences. In Heidegger's talk of sense this is discarded. He follows his inclination to hypostasis. Findings made in the conditioned sphere have a semblance of unconditionality conferred upon them by the mode of their expression. What makes this possible is the oscillating character of the word being. If we conceive true being radically from entity, it is identical with its meaning. We need only state the sense of the essence, being, to have the sense of being itself. We do not notice that in following this schema the attempt to break out of idealism is revoked and the doctrine of being turned back into one of thought, a doctrine which strips being of everything other than pure thought, in order to get it to make any sort of sense, now felt by its absence. A compensatory summons goes out to the field which in analytical judgment is set up from the outset as the realm of sense, to the theory of meanings. It is a fact that if concepts are to be concepts at all they must mean something, and this fact serves as a vehicle for the thesis that their being itself must be meaningful because it is not given otherwise than as a concept, a linguistic meaning, that this concept is not to be a concept, that it is supposed to be immediate, rather, shrouds the semantic sense in ontological dignity. Our talk of being never understands this name in the sense of a species to whose empty generality the historically offered doctrines of entity belong as individual cases. Being speaks ever and ever as sent and hence pervaded by tradition. 19. This is the source from which such a philosophy draws its comfort. It is the magnet of fundamental ontology, far beyond its theoretical substance. Ontology prescribed, out of the human mind. Ontology wants to restore the order shattered by the mind, along with the authority of that order. Its tendency freely to deny freedom shows when the expression entwerf, draft, design, is traced to the verb werfen, to throw. Transsubjective commitment is placed into a subjectively positing act, an all too tangible absurdity which Heidegger could later put down only in dogmatic fashion, when the memory of subjectivity was eliminated from the concept. 20. Added to the mythologization of being as the sphere of sending. 21 was Heidegger's mythical hubris, his proclamation of the subject's decree as a plan of supreme authority and his disguise of his own voice as that of being. Any consciousness that fails to go along was disqualified as oblivious of being. 22. Such a claim, such a prescription of order, is in full accord with Heidegger's thought structure. Its only chance is to do violence to thinking, for the loss that echoes in the corny tremolo of the phrase obliviousness of being was no stroke of fate. It was motivated. The mourned object, a legacy from the early, dissipated for a consciousness wresting itself from nature. The myth itself showed up as a delusion. Delusion alone, and command, can bring it to mind. The self-stylization of being as a beyond, a thing beyond the critical concept, is supposed, after all, to give the myth the legal title which heteronomy requires as long as a residue of the Enlightenment survives. Suffering under that which Heidegger's philosophy calls loss of being is not merely untrue, else he would scarcely look to Hölderlin for succor. Society's own concept says that men want their relations to be freely established, but no freedom has been realized in their relations to this day, and society remains as rigid as it is defective. All qualitative moments whose totality might be something like a structure are flattened in the universal barter relationship. The more immense the power of the institutional forms, the more chaotic the life they hem in and deform in their image. The production and reproduction of life, along with whatever the name superstructure covers, are not transparencies of reason, of that reason whose reconciled realization alone would be as one with a non-violent order, an order worthy of men. The old, nature-spawned orders have either passed away or outlived their legitimacy in the direction of evil. By no means is the course of society anywhere as anarchic as it appears in the accidental and always irrational form of an individual fate, but its objectified legality is the converse of a state of dasein in which men could live without fear. This is felt in the ontological drafts. They projected on the victims, the subjects, and they frantically drown out premonitions of objective negativity with their message of order in itself, up to the most abstract order, the structure of being. In place after place the world is set to shift to the horrors of order, not, as apologetic philosophy overtly or covertly complains, to the opposite. That freedom has largely remained an ideology, that men are powerless against the system, cannot rationally determine their lives and the life of the whole, cannot even think of such a determination without adding to their torment. This is what forces their rebellion into the wrong, invidious form of preferring the bad to a semblance of the better, and this is what the up-to-date philosophies are glad to toil for. The tragic Hitlerian pose of lonely valor makes them feel already in tune with the dawning order of the most powerful interests. Their posturing as metaphysically homeless and nothingness bound is ideology, an attempt to justify the very order that drives men to despair and threatens them with physical extinction. The resonance of the resurrected metaphysics is anticipatory consent to an oppression whose potential triumph is inherent in Western society, and which has long triumphed in the East, where the thought of having gained freedom is twisted into unfreedom. Heidegger promotes slave thinking. With the standard gesture against the marketplace of public opinion he spurns the word humanism, taking his place in the united front of thunderers against all isms. The current talk of humanism is awful enough, but one may well ask whether Heidegger would not end the talk solely because his doctrine would end the matter. Protest against reification, despite its authoritarian intentions. However, the new ontology, now several experiences richer, will seldom be as frank in its praise of hierarchy as in the days when a disciple of Schiller's published a treatise on the medieval world, and the tactics of covering every flank is in harmony with the social phase whose states of dominion are only half-heartedly based on a past stage of society. Those who seize power reckon with the anthropological end products of bourgeois society. They need those products, as the Führer rises above an atomized nation, as he thunders against social prejudice and, to perpetuate himself, will change the guard on occasion. So will the hierarchic leanings from the early days of the ontological renaissance fade out in the omnipotence and solitude of being. This too is more than ideology. The anti-relativism that goes back to Husserl's prolegomena to pure logic, the work that established logical absolutism, blends with an aversion to static, reified thought, an aversion expressed in German idealism and by Marx, but initially neglected by the early Schiller and the first rudiments of the new ontology. Anyway, relativism has gone somewhat out of style. You do not hear so much twaddle about it either. An imperceptible change has taken place in the philosophical need, From a need for substance and solidity it has turned into a need to avoid the spiritual reification which society has carried out and categorically dictated to its members. And the means to avoid this is a metaphysics that condemns such reification, limits it by appealing to an origin we cannot lose, but actually does no more serious harm to reification than ontology does to the scientific bustle. Of the compromised eternal values nothing remains but trust in the sanctity of being, the essence before all things, because in view of being, which is supposed to be dynamic in itself, to be happening, the reified world is contemptibly unintrinsic. It is considered not worth changing, so to speak. The critique of relativism is enhanced to branding the progressive rationality of Western thought, and all subjective reason, as heresy. The affection against the subversive intellect, tried and tested and already rekindled by public opinion, combines with that against material alienation. There has always been an interaction between the two. Heidegger is anti-thing and anti-functional in one. Under no circumstances is being to be a thing, and yet, as the metaphors keep indicating, it is to be the ground and something solid. 23 Coming to light in this is the fact that subjectification and reification do not merely diverge, they are correlates. The more knowledge is functionalized and made a product of cognition, the more perfectly will its moment of motion be credited to the subject as its activity, while the object becomes the result of the labor that has congealed in it, a dead thing. The reduction of the object to pure material, which precedes all subjective synthesis as its necessary condition, sucks the object's own dynamics out of it, it is disqualified, immobilized, and robbed of whatever would allow motion to be predicated at all. Not in vain did Kant call a class of categories dynamics. 24 Even devoid of dynamics, however, the material is not flatly immediate. Despite its seeming absolute concreteness it is transmitted by abstraction, impaled, as it were, to begin with. Life becomes polarized, wholly abstract and wholly concrete, although it would be only in the tension between them. The two poles are equally reified, and what is left of the spontaneous subject, the pure apperception, ceases to be a subject. In the hypostatized logicity of a Kantian cogito, detached from any living eye, it is covered by the all-controlling rigidity. Only, in Heidegger's critique of reification, what originates in reality is placed without much ado upon the shoulders of whichever intellect repeats the cogitative performance, although this intellect itself, along with the world of its experience, is reified by the reality. What the mind does is not the fault of presumptuous irreverence. Rather, the mind passes on what it is forced to pass on by the real context in which it is but a moment. It takes untruthfulness to push reification back into being and into a history of being, to mourn and consecrate as faith what might perhaps be changed by self-reflection and by the action it kindles. The doctrine of being does indeed, legitimately, insofar as it goes against positivism, hand down the fundament of the entire philosophical history it slanders, notably Kant's and Hegel's, the view that the dualisms of within and without, of subject and object, of essence and appearance, of concept and fact, are not absolute, but their reconcilement is projected into the irretrievable origin, and thus dualism itself, the target of the whole conception, is steeled against the reconciling impulse. The dirge about obliviousness of being sabotages reconcilement, a mythically impervious history of being, to which hope may cling, denies reconcilement. Its fateful character could and should be dispelled as a context of delusions. The wrong need, this delusive context extends not only to the ontological drafts, however, it extends equally to the needs which the drafts are to meet, to the needs into which the drafts and explicitly read something like a warrant for their theses. The need itself, the spiritual no less than the material, is subject to criticism now that even hardboiled naivete can no longer depend on it that social processes will go directly by supply and demand, and thus by needs. Needs are not invariant and undivisible, and neither do they guarantee their satisfaction. The semblance and the illusion that they must be met wherever they appear can be traced back to the same faulty consciousness, be they ever so tangible. Needs that are heteronomously produced participate in ideology. Nothing real, of course, can be neatly peeled out of its ideological shell if the critique itself is not to succumb to ideology, to the ideology of a simple natural life. Real needs can objectively be ideologies without entitling us to deny them, for in the needs of even the people who are covered, who are administered, there reacts something in regard to which they are not fully covered, a surplus of their subjective share, which the system has not wholly mastered. Material needs should be respected even in their wrong form, the form caused by overproduction. The ontological need too has its real moment in a state in which men can neither recognize nor admit the rationality, the sense, of the necessity that rules their conduct. The faulty consciousness of their needs aims at things not needed by subjects, human beings who have come of age, and thus it compromises every possible fulfillment. Added to the faulty consciousness is that it makes us believe in the attainability of unattainable things, complementary to the possibility of meeting needs the fulfillment of which is denied us. At the same time, inverted needs of that sort also spiritualize our unconscious suffering under the material denial. This suffering is as bound to press us to reverse the denial as the need alone will not reverse it. A thought without a need, a thought that wished for nothing, would be like nothing. But a thought based on a need becomes confused if our conception of the need is purely subjective. Needs are conglomerates of truth and falsehood. What would be true is the thought that wants the right thing. If there is any truth to the doctrine that human needs cannot be told by a state of nature, only by the so-called cultural standard, the conditions of social production along with their bad irrationality are also part of that standard. Its irrationality must be ruthlessly criticized against the needs of the mind, the substitute for all that has been withheld. The new ontology in itself is a substitute. What is promised as lying beyond the idealistic approach remains a latent idealism and a barrier to the incisive critique of idealism. Not only the primitive wish fulfillments which the cultural industry feeds to the masses, who do not really believe in them, are generally substitutes. Delusion is boundless in the field in which the official culture can and deposits its assets, in the supposedly sublime field of philosophy. Its most urgent need today appears to be the need for something solid. This need inspires the ontologies. It is what they adjust to. Its right lies in the will of people to be safe from being buried by a historical dynamics they feel helpless against. The immovable is to conserve the old and condemned. The more hopeless is longing, blocked by the extant forms of society, the more irresistible the trend of desperate self-preservation to a philosophy that is to be both in one, desperate and self-preserving. The invariant frames are made in the image of an omnipresent terror, of the dizziness that overcomes a society threatened by total destruction. If the threat threat vanished, its positive reversal, itself nothing but its abstract negation, would probably vanish with it. Weakness and support. A more specific need is that for a structure of invariance as a reaction to an idea drafted by conservative culture critics in the 19th century and popularized since, that the world has become formless. The idea fed on art historical theses like the one of an extinguished style-building force, originating in aesthetics. It spread as a view of the whole, the basic assumption of the art historians, that this loss is in fact a loss, and not indeed a powerful step toward unshackling the productive forces, is by no means established. Aesthetically revolutionary theoreticians such as Adolf Loos still dared to say so at the beginning of the century. 25 It has been forgotten only by the frightened culture critics, oath-bound since to the existing culture. The lament about the loss of ordering forms increases with their very power. Institutions are more powerful than ever. They have long since produced something like the neon-lit style of the culture industry, a style that covers the world as the turn to the Baroque did once upon a time. The conflicts between subjectivity and forms is undiminished, but under the universal rule of forms a consciousness that feels impotent, that has lost confidence in its ability to change the institutions and their mental images, will reverse the conflict into identification with the aggressor. The lament about a worldwide loss of forms is the artist to the call for a binding order, which the subject tacitly expects to come heteronomously, from outside. That loss, insofar as its assertion is more than mere ideology, is not the fruit of the subject's emancipation, it is the fruit of the failure of emancipation. What appears as the formlessness of a Dasein moduled solely after subjective reason is in fact that which enslaves the subjects, the pure principle of being for something else, of being merchandise. For the sake of universal equivalence and comparability this principle depreciates qualitative definitions everywhere. Its tendency is to bring all things down to one level, yet the same merchandise character, the indirect rule of men over other men, consolidates the subject's state of tutelage. Their coming of age and their freedom to think qualitatively would go together. Under the searchlight of modern art, style itself reveals its repressive moments. The need for form that has been borrowed from style fools people about the bad, coercive side of form. If a form does not prove by itself, by its transparent function, that it is entitled to live, if it is merely posited in order that there be form, such a form is untrue and thus inadequate even as a form. The mind which is to be persuaded that it is sheltered in forms is potentially beyond them. The effort so to arrange the world that it would stop obeying formal categories contrary to the most advanced consciousness has failed, and it is only because of this failure that the prevailing consciousness must frantically champion those categories as its own cause. Because the mind cannot wholly repress their inadequacy, however, it opposes the present, starkly visible heteronomy with another heteronomy, whether past or abstract, with values that are viewed as corsi sui, and with the phantasm of their reconcilement with the living. Radical modern art is hated, with restorative conservatism and fascism ALWIs in blissful accord, because it reminds us of mischances, but also because by its sheer existence it reveals the dubiousness of the heteronomous structural ideal. The subjective consciousness of men is socially too enfeebled to birth the invariance it is imprisoned in. Instead, it adapts itself to them while mourning their absence. The reified consciousness is a moment in the totality of the reified world. The ontological need is the metaphysics of that consciousness even when its doctrinal content leads it to exploit the critique of reification that has nowadays become so cheap. The form of invariance as such is a projection of what is congealed in the reified consciousness, incapable of experiencing things not already contained in the repertory of ever sameness. That consciousness recoins immutability into the idea of something eternal, of transcendence. In a state of unfreedom no one, of course, has a liberated consciousness, but such a consciousness which would have power over itself, which would really be as autonomous as it so far always only pretended to be, would not need to be continually afraid of losing itself to something else, secretly, to the powers that rule it. The need for support, for a supposed substantiality, is not so substantial as its self-righteousness would have it be. It is a sign of the weakness of the I, rather, known to psychologists as a presently typical human impairment. A man no longer oppressed from without and within himself would not be looking for support, perhaps not even for himself. Subjects who manage to save some of their freedom even under heteronomous conditions suffer less of a lack of support and do the unfree, who are only too glad to charge that lack to freedom, as freedom's fault. If men no longer had to equate themselves with things, they would need neither a superstructure of things nor an invariant picture of themselves, after the model of things. The doctrine of invariance perpetuates how little has changed. Its positivity perpetuates what is bad about it. This is why the ontological need is wrong. It is probably not until after the invariants have fallen that metaphysics would dawn on the horizon. But this consolation does not help much. An idea whose time has come has no time to waste. To wait in the clutch is to go along with the separation of temporality and eternity. The separation is wrong, and yet the answers that would be required are blocked off at the historic hour. Hence the antinomical character of all questions aimed at consolation. 2. Being and existence. Immanent critique of ontology. Our critique of the ontological need brings us to an immanent critique of ontology itself. We have no power over the philosophy of being if we reject it generally, from outside, instead of taking it on in its own structure, turning its own force against it, in line with Hegel's desideratum. The motivations and results of Heidegger's thought movements can be construed even where they are not uttered. There is hardly a sentence of his without its positional value in the functional context of the whole. In that sense he is a successor to the deductive systems. Their history is already full of concepts spawned by cogitative progress. Even if we cannot put a finger on the corresponding facts, the need to form these concepts is the source of philosophy's speculative element. The thought movement that congealed in them must be reliquified, its validity traced, so to speak, in repetition. It is not enough to demonstrate to the philosophy of being that what it calls being does not exist, that there is no such thing, for it does not postulate this sort of being there. Instead, such a blind being would have to be deduced in reply to the irrefutable claim that exploits the blindness. The very senselessness whose establishment elicits yells of positivistic triumph is plausible from the viewpoint of philosophical history. Because the secularization of theological contents once deemed objectively binding is irrevocable, the apologist for those contents must strive to rescue them through subjectivity. The religious doctrine of the Reformation virtually did so. It surely was the thought figure of Kantian philosophy. Enlightenment has since made irresistible strides, with subjectivity itself drawn into the demythologizing process. This reduced the chances of rescue to a borderline value. Paradoxically, the hope for it has been ceded to its relinquishment, to an unreserved and at the same time self-reflecting secularization. Heidegger's approach is true insofar as he accepts that and denies traditional metaphysics. He becomes untrue where, not unlike Hegel, he talks as if the contents we want to rescue were thus directly in our minds. The philosophy of being fails as soon as it claims a sense in being, a sense which its own testimony shows to have been dissolved by the thought to which being itself, since its conception, is still attached as a conceptual reflection. The senselessness of the word being, at which common sense finds it so easy to sneer, cannot be laid to either thinking too little or or irresponsibly thinking too fast. It is the sediment of the impossibility of grasping or producing any positive sense by the thought that was the medium of the objective evaporation of such sense. If we try to accomplish Heidegger's distinction of being from the concept that circumscribes it logically, we are left, after deducting entity as well as the categories of abstraction, with an unknown quantity which nothing but the pathos of its invocation lifts above the Kantian concept of the transcendent thing in itself. Yet this makes the very word thinking, which Heidegger will not renounce, as unsubstantial as the thing to be thought. Thinking without a concept is not thinking at all. The true philosophical task, according to Heidegger, would be to conceive being, yet being resists any cogitative definition. This makes the appeal to conceive it a hollow one. Heidegger's objectivism, the interdict he hurls against the thinking subject, is its faithful reverse image. Lines that a positivist finds bereft of sense present a promissory note to the eon. Those lines are false only because they claim to make sense, because they sound like the echo of a substance. It is not sense that inhabits the inmost core of Heidegger's philosophy, expounded as a knowledge of salvation. It is what Scheele called a knowledge of dominion. Heidegger's cult of being, his polemics against the idealistic cult of the mind, does of course presuppose a critique of the deification of being. But Heidegger's being, all but indistinguishable from its antipode, the mind, is no less repressive than the mind. It is only less transparent than the mind, whose principle was transparency, and therefore even less capable of critical self-reflection on the nature of dominion than the philosophies of the mind had ever been. The electric charge of Heidegger's word being goes well with the praise which a neutralized culture bestows upon the devout or faithful as such, as if their devotions and beliefs were merits in themselves, regardless of the truth of what they believe. This neutralization comes into its own in Heidegger. Faith in being strikes out all the substance that had been non-committee dragged along in the half or fully secularized religions. Heidegger drills in religious customs, but all that he retains of them is the general confirmation of dependence and submissiveness as surrogates of the objective formal laws of thought. Like logical positivism, the structure clings to the initiate while permanently eluding him. With the facts stripped of all that makes them more than facts, Heidegger seizes upon the waste product, so to speak, of the evaporating aura. He assures philosophy of something like a post-existence, provided it will make the its specialty. The expression of being is nothing but the feeling of this aura. It is an aura without a light-giving star, of course, one in which the indirect element becomes isolated and thus direct. But indirectness can no more be hypostatized than can the poles of subject and object. It is valid only in their constellation. Transmission is transmitted by what it transmits. Heidegger overstretches it into a sort of non-objective objectivity. He settles in an imaginary realm between the obtuse factor bruta and the twaddle about Weltanschauung. The concept of being, whose transmissions are not to be put into words, becomes an essence which Aristotle recognized in the Platonic idea, the paragon of essence. It becomes a repetition of entity, from which Heidegger takes away whatever he gives to being, with the emphatic claim of being to be purely essential thus voided. Entity, indelibly inherent in being without, in Heidegger's version, having to admit its ontical character, shares as a parasite in that ontological claim. That being shows, and that the subject should accept it passively, is borrowed from the old epistemological data which were supposed to be factual, ontical in character. However, in the sacral domain of being this ontical character simultaneously sheds the trace of contingency that used to permit its critique, by virtue of the logic of the philosophical aporia, and without waiting for the philosopher to add his ideology, Heidegger transposes the empirical superiority of the way things are into the realm of essence, the idea of being as an entity whose cognitive definition would inevitably miss the thought by dissecting and thus, to use a current political term, subverting it. What this idea amounts to is conclusiveness, as in the one-time closed Eleatic system and in today's closed world. Unlike the system's intent, however, the conclusiveness is heteronymous, beyond achievement by either the rational will of individuals or that total social subject which has not been realized to this day. In the statically renewed society we see ahead, no more new motives seem to swell the stockpile of apologetic ideology. Rather, the current motives are diluted and rendered unrecognizable to such an extent that actual experience is hard put to refute them. If the flashbacks and other tricks of philosophy project an entity upon being, the entity is satisfactorily justified. If it is treated with disdain, as a mere entity, it may go on making mischief outside, without hindrance. There is little difference from the sensibility of dictators who avoid visits to concentration camps whose staff is honestly carrying out their directives. Copula, the cult of being lives by the age-old ideology of the idolaphore, by that which thrives in the darkness of the word being and of the forms derived from it, establishes a context of existential judgment between the grammatical subject and the predicate, thus suggesting something ontical. Taken purely by itself, however, as a copula, it means at the same time the general, categorical fact of a synthesis, without representing anything ontical. Hence it can be entered straightways on the ontological side of the ledger. From the logicity of the copula, Heidegger gets the ontological purity that suits his allergy to all things factual, and from existential judgment he gets the memory of things ontical, which will permit the categorial achievement of the synthesis to be hypostatized. Then, as given, even the word is, of course, has a state of facts corresponding to it. In every predicative judgment, is has its meaning, as have the subject and the predicate, but the state of facts is a matter of intentionality, not of being. The copula, by definition, is fulfilled only in the relation between subject and predicate. It is not independent. Heidegger, in misplacing it beyond the sole source of its meaning, succumb. Its generality is a promissory note on particularization, the general form in which to carry out particular acts of judgment. Nomenclature takes this into account by reserving the scientific term copula for that generality, and for the particular job required in each judgment it reserves the is. Heidegger ignores the difference. As a result, the particular job of is comes to be merely something like a phenomenal mode of the generality. The difference between the category and the substance of the existential judgment is blurred. The substitution of the general grammatical form for the apophantic content transforms the ontical task of is into an ontological one, a way of being to be. Yet if the task that is postulated, transmitted, and transmitting in the sense of is were neglected in the particular, that is would retain no substrate of any kind. There would be nothing left but the abstract form of transmission in general. This pure becoming, in Hegel's word, is no more a primal principle than any other, unless one wishes to drive out Parmenides with Heraclitus. The word Word being has an overtone that can be missed in arbitrary definition only. It is what lends Heidegger's philosophy its timbre. Every entity is more than it is, as we are reminded by being. In contrast to entity, there is no entity whose determination and self-determination does not require something else, something which the entity itself is not, for by itself alone it would not be definable. It therefore points beyond itself. Transmission is simply another word for this. Yet Heidegger seeks to hold on to that which points beyond itself, and to leave behind, as rubble, the beyond which it points. To him, entwinement turns into its absolute opposite, into in the word being, the totality of that which is. The copula has become an object. We could, of course, not talk of an is without being any more than we can talk of being without an is. The word points to the objective element which in each predicative judgment qualifies the very synthesis required for its own crystallization. Yet being is no more independent of the is than that state of facts in a judgment is independent of it. The dependence of the forms of language, which Heidegger rightly takes to be more than mere signification, bears witness against the things he will squeeze out of language. If grammar couples the is with the substrate category being as its asset, that something is, it will reciprocally use being only in relation to all there is, rather than in itself. True, the appearance of ontological purity is strengthened by the fact that every analysis of judgments leads to two moments of which neither one can be reduced to the other, no more than, metrologically, subject and object can be so reduced. A thought fascinated by the chimera that anything is absolutely first will eventually tend to claim that even this irreducible thing itself is the last. The reduction to irreducibility vibrates in Heidegger's concept of being, but it is a formalization that does not jibe with a rigorous distinction has to be made. What it formalizes, taken by itself, it means no more than a negative, that whenever we judge, the moments of judgment will not go into each other on either side. In other words, that they are not identical. Outside this relation of the moments of judgment, irreducibility is nothing. There is nothing we can mean by it, hence our inability to impute to it an ontological priority over the moments. The paralogism lies in the transformation of that negative, that one of the moments cannot be reduced to the other, into something positive. Heidegger gets as far as the borderline of dialectical insight into the non-identity in identity, but he does not carry through the contradiction in the concept of being. He suppresses it. What can somehow be conceived as being mocks the notion of an identity between the concept and that which it means. But Heidegger treats it as an identity, as pure being itself, devoid of its otherness. The non-identity in absolute identity is covered up like a skeleton in the family closet, because it is neither a merely subjective function nor a thing, an entity, because to our traditional way of thinking it is no objectivity. Heidegger calls a being, that non-subjective, non-objective third. The transition ignores the intent of the term as whose humble interpreter Heidegger regards himself. The insight that is can be called neither a mere thought nor a mere entity does not permit its transfiguration into something transcendent in relation to those two definitions. Every attempt to conceive the is at all, even in the palest generality, leads to entities on the one side and to concepts on the other. The constellation of moments is not to be reduced to a singular essence. What is inherent in that constellation is not an essence. The unity promised by the word being lasts only so long as it is not conceived, as its meaning is not analyzed in line with Heidegger's own method. Any such analysis will bring to light what disappeared in the abyss of being. But if the analysis becomes taboo, aparia turns into subreption. We are to conceive being as the absolute, but it is to be the absolute only because we cannot conceive it. It shines beyond the moments only because it magically blinds our cognition of moments. A rationality that cannot do its best strikes itself as the worst. No transcendence of being. Contrary to the linguistic atomization practiced by Heidegger, the believer in entirety, there is already a kind of coagination between all single concepts and themselves and the judgments neglected by a classifying logic. The old tripartition of logic into concept, judgment, and conclusion is a relic like the system of Linné. Judgments are not a mere synthesis of concepts, for without judgment there is no concept, a fact which Heidegger overlooks, possibly under the influence of scholasticism. Yet within the indirectness of being as well as of is, the subject lies hidden. Another moment idealistic, if you will, which Heidegger discards, thus enhancing subjectivity into the absolute that precedes all subject-object dualism. Every analysis of a judgment takes us to a subject and an object, but this fact does not create a region beyond those moments, a region that would be in itself. The analysis results in the constellation of those moments, not in a third that would be superior, or at least more general. One might, of course, say in Heidegger's sense that is not a thing, not an entity, not what we usually mean by objectivity, for is has no substrate without the synthesis. In the state of facts that we mean, there is no corresponding we might interpret it as being. Therefore, we conclude, is must indicate that third, which is being. But our conclusion is wrong. A tour de force of self-sufficient semantics. The paralogism is evinced by the fact that we cannot conceive such a supposedly pure substrate of is. Every attempt to do so runs into transmissions of which the hypostatized being would be relieved. To Heidegger, however, its very inconceivability yields a profit, an addition to the metaphysical dignity of being. Its refusal to submit to human thought is said to make it the absolute, because, in the best Hegelian manner, it cannot be reduced either a subject or an object without leaving a remainder. It is regarded as beyond subject and object, although, independently of them, it would indeed not be at all. In the end, human reason, which cannot conceive being, is itself disparaged, as if there were any way to separate thought from reason. Undeniably, being is not simply the totality of all there is, of all that is the case. With this anti-positivistic insight we do justice to the concept surplus over factuality. No concept would be thinkable, indeed none would be possible without the more that makes a language of language. But what goes in the word being as opposed to, that everything is more than it is, means entwinement, not something transcendent to entwinement. This is what Heidegger makes of it, something added to the individual entity. He pursues dialectics to the point of saying that neither the subject nor the object are immediate and ultimate, but he deserts dialectics in reaching for something immediate and primary beyond subject and object. Thinking becomes achaistic as soon as whichever scattered entity is more than entity will be transfigured into a metaphysical. Heidegger reacts to the loss of the aura one by arranging its function, turning the fact that things point beyond themselves into a substrate, and thus making that fact itself like a thing. He prescribes a repristination of the shudder caused, long before the mythical nature religions, by intermingling. Manner too is raised up under the name of being, as if our dawning impotence resembled that of pre-animistic primitives during a thunderstorm. Secretly, Heidegger obeys the law that the advancing rationality of their constantly irrational society makes men reach farther and farther into the past. Cautioned by trouble, he shuns the romantic Pelagianism of Klages and the powers of Oscar Goldberg. From the region of tangible superstition he flees to a dusk in which not even such mythologism as that of the reality of images will take shape any longer. He eludes criticism, but without letting go of the advantages of originality. The origin is placed so far back that it will seem extratemporal and therefore omnipresent. It does not work, however. 3. There is no other way to break out of history than regression. Its goal, the most ancient of goals, is not truth but absolute semblance. Dull imprisonment in a nature we do not see through. A mere parody of the supernatural. Heidegger's transcendence is an absolutized immanence. Obdurate being, as the basic theme of philosophy, is no class or genus of entities, yet it pertains to every entity. Its universality is to be against its own immanent character. That semblance needs an explanation. How being, flatly deduced and transmitted, can commandeer the insignia of ens concretissimum. The semblance rests upon the fact that the two poles of traditional epistemology and metaphysics, the pure, present object and pure thought, are both abstract, both removed from so many definitions that little more is to be said about them if we want our judgments to go by what we judge. Thus the two poles seem indistinguishable from each other, and this permits the unnoticed substitution of one for the other, depending on what is to be proved. The concept of entity at large, ideally without any category, is stripped of all qualifications, so it need not let itself be confined to any particular entity and may call itself being. Yet being, as an absolute concept, need not legitimize itself as a concept. By any definition it would delimit itself and violate its own meaning. Hence it may as well be garbed in the dignity of immediacy as in that of essentiality. Heidegger's entire philosophy is set between these two extremes which are indifferent to one another. Against his will, however, sought higher up, being in the structure. Entity comes to the fore in being. Being gets its life from the forbidden fruit, as if the fruit were free as apples. Being, for its oral absoluteness sake, must not be contaminated with any entity, yet nothing but such contamination can give being the immediacy that furnishes the legal title for the claim of absoluteness. That being always means also as much as entity pure and simple. As soon as the talk of being adds anything to pure invocation, the addition will come from the ontical sphere. Heidegger's rudiments of material ontology are temporal. They have come to be, and they will pass as Scheller's did before. Expressing the inexpressible, we fail to do justice to the concept of being, however, until we also grasp the genuine experience that effects its instauration. The philosophical urge to express the inexpressible, the more anxiously a philosophy resists that urge, which is its peculiarity, the greater the temptation to tackle the inexpressible directly, without the labor of Sisyphus, which, by the way, would not be the worst definition of philosophy and does so much to bring ridicule upon it. Philosophy itself, as a form of the mind, contains a moment deeply akin to the state of suspense which Heidegger assigns to the topic of meditation, and which prevents meditation. For philosophy is form in a far more specific sense than the history of state of facts is dialectical. Its concept leads us to suspect, in that history except in a Hegelian stratum, it is rare for philosophy to incorporate in its reflection the qualitative difference that sets it apart from science, from the theory of science, and from logic. For all its coagination with all three of them, philosophy consists neither in veritas de raison nor in veritas de fate. Nothing it says will bow to tangible criteria of any being the case. Its theses on conceptualities are no more subject to the criteria of a logical state of facts than its theses on factualities are to the criteria of empirical science. Its detachment adds to its fragility. It will not be nailed down. Its history is one of permanent failure insofar as, terrorized by science, it would keep searching for tangibility. It has earned the positivist criticism by claiming to have a scientific approach, a claim rejected by science. But these critics are wrong when they confront philosophy with unphilosophical criteria as soon as these criteria are even slightly in line with the philosophical idea. Philosophy will not dispense with truth, however, but will illuminate the narrowness of scientific truth. The determinant of its suspended state is that even while keeping its distance from the verifying type of cognition it is not non-committal, that the life it leads has a stringency of its own. Philosophy seeks stringency in that which it is not, in its opposite, and in the reflection on what, with a poor sort of naivete, is viewed as binding by positive cognition. Philosophy is neither a science nor the cogitative poetry to which positivists would degrade it in a stupid oxymoron. It is a form transmitted to those which differ from it as well as distinguished from them. Its suspended state is nothing but the expression of its inexpressibility. In this respect it is a true sister of music. There is scarcely a way to put the suspension into words, which may have caused the philosophers, except for Nietzsche, perhaps, to gloss it over. It is more the premise of understanding philosophical texts than it is their succinct quality. It may have sprung forth historically and may fall silent again, as music is in danger of doing. Heidegger has innovated this and literally transformed that specific trait of philosophy, perhaps because it is on the point of extinction, into a specialty, an objectivity of quasi-superior rank, a philosophy that knows it is judging neither facts nor concepts the way other things are judged, a philosophy that is not even sure what it is dealing with, would seek a positive content just the same, beyond facts, concepts, and judgments. The suspended character of thought is thus raised to the very inexpressibility which the thought seeks to express. The non-objective is enhanced into the outlined object of its own essence, and thereby violated. Under the weight of tradition, which Heidegger wants to shake off, the inexpressible becomes explicit and compact in the word being, while the protest against reification becomes reified, divorced from thinking, and irrational. By treating the inexpressible side of philosophy as his immediate theme, Heidegger dams up philosophy all the way back to the revocation of consciousness. By way of punishment, the well he wants to excavate dries up. It is a buried well, in his conception, oozing a scantier trickle than ever came from the insights of the allegedly destroyed philosophy that inclines indirectly to the inexpressible. What Heidegger attributes to the poverty of our time is the poverty of a thought that fancies itself beyond time. The direct expression of the inexpressible is void, where the expression carried, as in great music, its seal was evanescence and transitoriness, and it was attached to the process, not to an indicative that's it. Thoughts intended to think the inexpressible by abandoning thought falsify the inexpressible. They make of it what the thinker would least like it to be, the monstrosity of a flatly abstract object. The child's question, if it were not too ontical psychological for them. Functional ontologists might argue that every child asks about being. Reflection cures him of that habit, and as always in idealism, reflection on the reflection seeks to compensate wait for the cure, but the doubled reflection will hardly ask directly, as the child does, with the anthropomorphism of an adult, so to speak. Philosophy pictures the conduct of the child as that of the childhood of the species, as before and above time. The child has trouble with his relation to words, which he appropriates with an effort that can scarcely be imagined anymore at a later age. He has far less trouble with the world that is fairly familiar to him, in his early phases, as made up of objects of action. He wants to find out what the words mean, and the occupation with them, as well as an impish, nagging, psychoanalytically explicable stubbornness, perhaps, leads him to the relation of words and things. He may get on his mother's nerves with the awkward problem why a bench is called a bench. His naivete is unnaive, as language, culture has invaded his stirring consciousness very early, mortgaging the talk of originality. The meaning of the words and their truth content, their attitude toward objectivity, are not yet sharply distinguished from each other. To know what the word bench means and to know what a bench really is, which does include an existential judgment, is one and the same to that consciousness, or not differentiated, at least. Besides, in countless cases, the distinction takes an effort. It is thus precisely the childlike directness that is indirect in itself, with the acquired vocabulary for its orientation. The boring for the why, for the first cause, is preformed. Language is taken for granted. It is experienced as, not as. At the outset there is fetishism, and the hunt for the outset remains always subject to it. That fetishism is hard to see through, of course, since whatever we think is also a matter of language. Unreflective nominalism is as wrong as the realism that equips a fallible language with the attributes of a revealed one. It is in Heidegger's favor that there is no speechless in itself. That language, therefore, lies in truth, not truth in language, as something merely signified by language. But the constitutive share of language and truth does not establish an identity of truth and language. The test of the power of language is that the expression and the thing will separate in reflection. For language becomes a measure of truth only when we are conscious of the non-identity of an expression with that which we mean. Heidegger refuses to engage in that reflection. He halts after the first step of language philosophical dialectics. His thinking is representative also in its aim to restore the power of the name by a ritual of nomenclature. Yet in our secularized languages this power is not present in a way that would let the subject accomplish the restoration. By secularization, the subjects have withdrawn the name from the languages, and the objectivity of language needs their intransigence, not a philosophical trust in God. Language is more than a sign only where it shows significative strength, where it most exactly and succinctly covers what is meant. It is only insofar as it comes to be, in the constant confrontation of expression and thing. This was the premise Karl Kraus proceeded on, though himself probably leaning toward an ontological view of language. Heidegger's procedure, on the other hand, is a Teutonizing Kabbalism, in Skollem's phrase. He treats the historic languages as if they were those of being, as romantically as any violent anti-romanticist. His kind of destruction halts before philological erudition, which he does not consider, but does suspend at the same time. Such a consciousness will affirm its environment, or will put up with it, at least, but a genuine philosophical radicalism, no matter what the form of its historical appearance, is a product of doubt. The radical question that will destroy nothing but the doubt is itself illusory. The question of being, the fundament beneath Heidegger's emphatic expression of the word being is an old category of his, one which later on goes all but unmentioned. Authenticity, the transcendence of being, as opposed to concept and entity, is to redeem the desideratum of authenticity as that which is not illusory, neither artificial nor moot. Protested against, with good reason, is the fact that the historic evolution of philosophy has leveled the distinction between essence and appearance. The inherent impulse of philosophy as discontent with the facade. Unreflecting enlighteners have negated the metaphysical thesis of essence as the true world behind the phenomena with an equally abstract counter-thesis, that essence, as the epitome of metaphysics, is itself mere appearance, as if appearance, therefore, were the same as essence. Because of the dichotomy in the world, its authentic element, the Lord dichotomy, is hidden. The positivist who adjusts to this by deleting as myth and subjective projection whatever is not a datum, whatever is hidden, adds as much to the elusiveness as was once added by doctrines that consoled men for their suffering in the mundus sensibilis by avowing the nominal. Heidegger did sense some of this mechanism, but the authenticity he misses will promptly recoil into positivity, into authenticity as a posture of consciousness, a posture whose emigration from the profane powerlessly imitates the theological habit of the old doctrine of essence. The hidden essence is rendered proof against the suspicion of being pure mischief. No one, for example, dares consider that the categories of the so-called mass trend, expounded in Being and Time as well as in Jasper's paperback on the intellectual situation of our time 5, may themselves be categories of that hidden mischief which makes men what they are, and they must let philosophy chide them to boot, then, for having forgotten the essence. The resistance to the reified consciousness, tremors of which linger in the pathos of authenticity, has been broken. The remaining criticism is unleashed against the phenomenon, in other words, against the subjects. The essence, whose self-reproducing guilt is merely represented by that of the subjects, remains undisturbed. While refusing to be distracted from the fundamental ontologists cut themselves off from an answer by the form in which they put the question what is authentic. Not for nothing is it dressed in the disgusting technical term question of being. This is mendacious because the appeal is to every individual's bodily concern, to the naked concern of Hamlet's soliloquy. Whether in death the individual is obliterated absolutely or has the hope of the Christian non-confunder. But what Hamlet means by being or not being is replaced by pure essence, in which existence is swallowed up, by making things thematically in accord with phenomenological custom, with a full array of descriptions and distinctions. Existential ontology satisfies the concern and distracts from it. The question of being, says Heidegger, aims therefore at ascertaining the a priori conditions not only for the possibility of the sciences which examine entities as entities of such and such a type, and, in so doing, already operate with an understanding of being, but also for the possibility of those ontologies themselves which are prior to the ontical sciences and which provide their foundations. Basically, all ontology, no matter how rich and firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its outmost aim, if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being, and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task. 6. What such lines, in complicated phenomenological fashion, regard as the question of being is so overstretched it will lose whatever can be conceived under the word, and the conception is further devalued, if possible, into so engrossing a bustle that the failure will commend itself as higher truth, as an authentic answer to the question that has been begged. Lest it be insufficiently authentic, the so-called question of being condenses into a zero-dimensional point, into what it admits as the sole true-born meaning of being. It turns into a ban on any step beyond this, and finally into a ban on any step beyond the tautology whose manifestation in Heidegger's prose is that time and again the self-uncovering being says nothing else but being. 7. If possible, Heidegger would pass off the tautological nature of being as something superior to the rules of logic, but it can be derived from apoetics, as Husserl before him. Heidegger will blithely boast it is the derived of thinking which he juxtaposes, although they have proved incompatible in the history of the metaphysics he withdrew from circulation, in overly sovereign fashion, to purity, the freedom from empirical admixtures that makes for absolute validity, and to the immediacy of flatly given things, irrefutable because they lack any conceptual adjunct. Thus Husserl combined his platform of a pure, i.e., eidetic, phenomenology with the postulate of a self-given phenomenal object. The title pure phenomenology is already a confluence of the contradictory norms. That it was to be no theory of knowledge but a position to be assumed at will, rather, relieved this phenomenology of the need to think through the interrelation of its categories. In this regard Heidegger differs from his mentor only insofar as he removes the contradictory program from consciousness, which was at stage 4 Husserl. Heidegger moves it into the transcendence of consciousness, a conception, by the way, that was already preformed in the preponderance of the noma in Husserl's middle period. Yet the incompatibility of the pure and the visual compels us to choose a substrate of their unity so indefinitely that it will no longer contain any moment in which one of the two postulates might belie the other. Hence Heidegger's being must be neither entity nor concept. The price it has to pay for thus becoming unimpeachable is its nihility, the fact that it defies fulfillment by any thought and any visuality, leaving us empty-handed but for the self-sameness of the mere name. Even the endless repetitions that abound in Heidegger's publications should not so much be laid to his garrulity as to apoetics. Definition alone brings a phenomenon beyond itself. What remains quite indefinite will compensate by being said over and over, just as a gesture that fails to impress its object will be made over and over, as an absurd ritual. The philosophy of being shares this ritual of repetition with the mythos it would so much like to be, looping the loop. The dialectics of being and entity, that no being can be conceived without an entity, and no entity without transmission, is suppressed by Heidegger. Moments that are not without one transmitting the other are to him directly one, and this one is positive being, but the figures do not come out even. Categories also will be sued for debt, though driven out with a pitchfork. Entity returns. A being purged of entity is a primal phenomenon only so long as the excluded entity lies nonetheless within it. Heidegger copes with this in a strategic masterpiece that is the matrix of his thinking as a whole. The term ontological difference permits his philosophy to lay hands even on the insoluble moment of entity. What we are to understand by such a being alleged to be quite independent of the ontical sphere, this, of course, has to remain unsettled. Definition would involve it in the dialectics of subject and object, in the very thing from which it is to be exempt. This indefiniteness at the probably most central point of Heidegger's ontology is the reason why the extremes being and entity must necessarily stay undefined toward each other as well, so that we cannot even say what the difference consists in. Talk of the ontological difference comes down to the tautology that being is not entity because it is being. Thus Heidegger himself makes the mistake for which he upbraids Western metaphysics, that it always left unsaid what is meant by being as distinct from entity. 8. The breath of this philosophy turns entity into an ontological state of facts, a dimmed and hypostatized expression of the impossibility to conceive being without entity, just as entity, according to Heidegger's basic thesis, cannot be to its concept, to the concept of the ontical, that which makes it an entity as opposed to the concept will disappear. The formal, generally conceptual structure of all talk of the ontical, and of all equivalents to this talk, takes the place of the substance of that concept, a substance heterogeneous to the conceptuality. What makes this possible is that the concept of entity, not at all unlike Heidegger's celebrated one of being, is the concept which encompasses out and out non-conceptuality, that which is not exhausted by the concept, yet without ever expressing its difference from the encompassed. Because entity is the concept for all entities, entity itself becomes a concept, an ontological structure that is convertible without a break into the structure of being. In being in time, the ontologization of entity is brought into a succinct formula. The essence of Dasein lies in its existence. 9. The outcome of the definition of entities in Dasein, of existence qua existence, by the concepts of Dasein and existence is that precisely what is not essential in Dasein, precisely what is not ontological in it, is ontological. The ontological difference is removed by means of a conceptualization of the non-conceptual into non-conceptuality. Mythology of being. The only time the ontical does not bother ontology is when it is of a kind. The only mythology non-difference with wayside, but the effect was already part Heidegger's entity as a mode of being to be, as each individual entity is reduced. Heidegger's doctrine of the distinction of Dasein as ontical and ontological at the same time, of the presence at hand of being, hypostatizes being from the start, unless being is independent as preceding Dasein, as he would like it to be. Dasein will not become that transparency of being which is supposed to uncover being in turn. In that sense too, the alleged conquest of subjectivism has been surreptitious. In spite of Heidegger's reductive plan, the doctrine of the transcendence of being served to smuggle back into entity the very same ontological primacy of subjectivity which the language of fundamental ontology abjures. Heidegger was consistent later, when he changed the course of the analysis of Dasein in the sense of an undiminished primacy of being, a primacy that cannot rest on entity because, precisely in this sense, being is not. With that, of course, all that had made Heidegger effective fell by the wayside, but the effect was already part of the authority of his later works to its concept, to the entity possible as that the concept of non-conceptual into non-mythology of being. The only time the ontical does not bother ontology is when it is of a kind with ontology. The subreption establishes the precedence of ontology over the ontological difference. But here we are not dealing with an antithesis of existentia and essentia, because these two metaphysical definitions of being, let alone their relationship, are not yet in question at all. 10. Heidegger, his assurances to the contrary notwithstanding, puts the alleged antecedent of the ontological difference on the side of essence, as the difference expressed in the concept of entity is denied. The concept is exalted by the non-conceptuality said to be beneath it. Another passage in the Plato tract makes this comprehensible where Heidegger shifts the question of existence away from existence and transforms it into one about essence. The statement statement, man exists, does not answer the question whether or not man is real. It answers the question about the essence of man. 11. The talk about not yet, in the same passage in which the antithesis of existence and essence is rejected. 12. Is not an accidental temporal metaphor for something other than temporal. Actually it is archaic thinking. Ionian Hylozoistic far more than Eleatic. The scarce philosophers of the former type that have come down to show a murky mixture of existence and essence. The toil and trouble of the metaphysicists of antiquity, from Parmenides, who had to split thinking and being so that he might identify them, down to Aristotle, consisted in forcing the division. Demythologization is division. The myth is the deceptive unity of the undivided, but the primal principles did not suffice to explain the world which they always denoted also. It is because this insufficiency led to analysis, with the result that the magical extraterritoriality of being as a vagrant between essence and fact was caught in the web of concepts. That Heidegger, to save the privilege of being, must condemn the concept's critical labors as a history of decay, as if philosophy might occupy a historical standpoint beyond history while on the other hand obeying a history that is ontologized itself, as is existence. Heidegger is anti-intellectualist under compulsion of the system and anti-philosophical on philosophical grounds, just as the present religious revivals do not get their inspiration from the truth of their doctrines but from the philosophy that religion would be good to have. As far back as we can trace it, the history of thought has been a dialectic of enlightenment. This is why Heidegger, resolutely enough, refuses to halt at any one stage of history, as he might perhaps have been tempted to do in his youth. It is why he takes a Welsh time machine, rather, to plunge into the abyss of archaicism in which everything can be everything and mean everything. He reaches out for mythology, but his mythology too remains one of the 20th century. It remains the illusion unmasked by history, an illusion made striking by the utter impossibility of reconciling the myth with the rationalized form of reality with which every possible consciousness is entwined. Heidegger's type of consciousness presumes to mythological status as if it could have that status without being mythological in kind. Showing up, along with Heidegger's concept of being, is the mythical concept of fate. The advent of entity rests upon the fate of being. 13. The eulogized undividedness of existence and essence in being is thus called by name as what it is. The blind context of nature, the doom of concatenation, the absolute negation of the transcendence whose tremolo notes quiver in the talk of being. The illusion in the concept of being is this transcendence, but the reason for it is that Heidegger's definitions, deducted from Dasein, from the miseries of real human history to this day, dispense with the memory of those miseries. His definitions turn into moments of being itself, and thus into things superior to that existence. Their astral power and glory is as cold to the infamy and fallibility of historic reality as that reality is sanctioned as immutable. The celebration of senselessness as sense is mythical, so is the ritualistic repetition of natural contexts in symbolic individual actions, as if that made these contexts supernatural. Categories such as angst, of which, at least, we cannot stipulate that they must be everlasting, are transfigured into constituents of being as such, into things superior to that existence, into its a priori. They are installed as the very sense which at the present state of history cannot be positively and immediately named. Absurdities are invested with sense, on the theory that the sense of being will appear precisely in the form of its antithesis, in the form of mere existence. Ontologization of the ontical. Hegel anticipated the special ontological position of Dasein by means of the idealistic thesis that the subject takes precedence. He exploited the fact that the non-identical on its part can be defined only as a concept. To him it was thereby removed from dialectics and brought to identity. The ontical was ontologized. Shadings of language and the logic make this quickly apparent, as the third note to becoming expounds. Space and time are explicitly defined as indefinite, which, to go back to its simplest form, is being. Yet this very indefiniteness of being is what makes out its definiteness, for indefiniteness is opposed to definiteness. So, as the opposite, it is itself defined as the negative, and as the purely, wholly abstractly negative at that. This indefiniteness or abstract negation, which being has in itself, is what external as well as internal reflection expresses by equating being with nothingness, by declaring it to be an empty thought figure, to be nothing. Or one may express it thus, because being is what lacks definition. It has not the affirmative being of definiteness. It is not being, with nothingness. 14. Tacitly, indefiniteness is used as a synonym for the undefined. Vanishing in the concept of indefiniteness is what it is the concept of. The concept is equated with the undefined as its definition, and this permits the undefined to be identified with nothingness. Thus the absolute idealism which logic would have to demonstrate first is in truth already presupposed. This is the point also of Hegel's refusal to begin with something rather than with being. That the non-identical is not immediate, that it is a matter of transmission, is trivial. But at central points Hegel fails to do justice to his own insight. The insight says that even though the non-identical is identical, as self-transmitted, it is nonetheless non-identical. It is otherness to all its identifications. Hegel does not carry the dialectics of non-identity to the end, although his intention elsewhere is to defend the pre-critical usage against that of the philosophy of reflection. His own concept of non-identity, to him a vehicle for turning it into identity, into equality with itself, inevitably has its opposite for its content. This he brushes aside in a hurry. What he explicitly stated in the tract on difference, and promptly integrated in his own philosophy, becomes the most serious objection to that philosophy. Hegel's absolute system, based upon the perennial resistance of the non-identical, negates itself, contrary to his own understanding. There is truly no identity without something non-identical, while in his writings identity, as totality, takes ontological precedence, assisted by the promotion of the indirectness of the non-identical to the rank of its absolute conceptual being. Theory, instead of bringing the indissoluble into its own concepts, swallows it by subsumption under its general concept, that of indissolubility. Identity's dependence on the non-identical, as Hegel almost achieved it, is the protest against any philosophy of identity. The Aristotelian category of steresis is the trump card of that protest, and its doom. The abstract concept necessarily lacks the ability to be non-conceptual, and Hegel credits this lack to it as a merit, as something loftier, as the spirit, as opposed to that from which he unavoidably abstracts. What is less is supposed to be truer, as later on in Heidegger's self-righteous ideology of splendid homeliness, the apologia for death is not merely one for a thinking that has once more shrunk to a point. It has its precise ideological function. The affectation of august simplicity warms up the dignity of indigence and frugal living. It suits the absurdity that real want is continuing in a society whose state of production no longer admits the plea that there are not enough goods to go around. Philosophy, barred from naivete by its own concept, helps looks over this absurdity by flirting with the Rhenish home companion. In its history of being, one has a radiance of superiority as such, at least at Calendus Graecus. Hegel already gave a rating of greater substantiality to the result of abstraction. Under the same topos he deals with matter, also with the transition to existence. 15. That its concept is indefinite, that as a concept it lacks precisely what is meant by it, is supposed to be why all light is cast on its form. Hegel fits this into Western metaphysics, at its outermost limits. Engels saw that, but came to the opposite, equally undialectical conclusion, that matter is the first being. 16. Dialectical criticism is due the concept of the first being itself. Heidegger repeats the Hegelian sleight of hand maneuver, except that Hegel's is practiced openly while Heidegger, not wanting to be an idealist, shrouds and beclouds the ontologization of the ontical, the mainspring for dressing up the deficiency of the concept as its surplus is in each case the old Platonic austerity, that whatever is non-sensual is more elevated. Logic achieves the utmost sublimation of the ascetic ideal and makes a fetish of it at the same time, devoid of the tension with the senses from which the ascetic ideal derives its truth as against the delusion of an authorized fulfillment. The concept, purified as it rejects its content, functions in secret as the model of a life that is arranged so no measure of mechanical progress, the equivalent of the concept, may ever, under any circumstances, do away with poverty. If ontology were possible at all, it would be possible in an ironic sense, as the epitome of negativity. What remains equal to itself, the pure identity, is the worst. The mythical doom is timeless. Philosophy has been its secularization, enthralled to the doom insofar as its gigantic euphemisms would reinterpret the immutable as the good, down to the theodicies of Leibniz and Hegel. If one were drafting an ontology in accordance with the basic state of facts, of the facts whose repetition makes their state invariant, such an ontology would be pure horror. An ontology of culture, above all, would have to include where culture as such went wrong. A philosophically legitimate ontology would have more of a place in construing the culture industry than in construing being. Good would be nothing but what has escaped from ontology. Function of the concept of existence. The ontologization of the ontical is the primary goal of the doctrine of existence. According to the age-old argument, existence cannot be deduced from essence, hence it is said to be essential in itself. It is raised above Kierkegaard's model, but this very elevation blunts the cutting edge it has for Kierkegaard. In the temple of existence, even the Bible word that by their fruits ye shall know them sounds like a profanation and must be silenced. As being's mode to be, existence is no longer the antithetical opposite of the concept. Its poignancy has been removed. It is awarded the dignity of the Platonic idea, but also the bulletproof character of something that cannot otherwise be conceived because it is no conception, because it is simply there. On this point Heidegger is in accord with Jaspers, who guilelessly admits the neutralization of existence against Kierkegaard. In his negative choices, I sensed the very opposite of everything I loved and wanted, of everything I was willing or unwilling to do. 17. Though not infected by the pater subtilis in his construction of the concept of being, Jaspers' own existentialism was understood from the outset as a search for being. 18. Without breaking faith with themselves, Jaspers and Heidegger both could make the sign of the cross at what was done in Paris in the sign of existence, at the phenomenon which all too quickly, for their taste, spread from the lecture halls to the bistros. 19. Where it sounded far less respectable. Of course, a critique confined to the thesis that the ontical cannot be ontologized will itself remain a judgment on invariant structural relations. It will remain too ontological, so to speak. This was the philosophical motive behind Sartre's turn to politics. There was something strengthless, something shadowy about the post-World War II movement that adopted the name existentialism and the bearing of an avant-garde. The existentialism which the German establishment suspects of subversive leanings resembles the beards of its adherents. The beard is the oppositionist costume of juveniles acting like cavemen who refuse to play along with the cultural swindle, while in fact they merely donned the old-fashioned emblem of the patriarchal dignity of their grandfathers. What is true in the concept of existence is the protest against a condition of society and scientific thought that would expel unregimented experience, a condition that would virtually expel the subject as a moment of cognition. Kierkegaard's protest against philosophy was also one against the reified consciousness in which, as he put it, subjectivity has been extinguished. He opposed philosophy for philosophy's own sake. In the French existentialist schools this is anachronistic repeated. The subjectivity that has been really incapacitated and internally weakened in the meantime is isolated and, complementing Heidegger's hypostasis of its counterpole, being, hypostatized, unmistakably in the cipher of being and nothingness. The severance of the subject amounts, like that of being, to the illusion that transmission is immediacy, as being is transmitted by the concept, and thus by the subject, so is the subject transmitted by the world it lives in, and so powerless and merely inwardly is its decision. Such impotence helps the reified mischief to triumph over the subject. The concept of existence impressed many as a philosophical approach because it seemed to combine divergent things, the reflection on the subject, said to constitute every cognition and thus every entity, and the concrete, immediate individuation of each single subject's experience. To the subjective approach, the divergence was an irritant in toto. The constitutive subject could be chided as a mere deduction from the empirical one, unfit to establish the empirical subject and any kind of empirical dasein, while the individual could be upbraided as an accidental bit of the world, lacking the essential necessity required to encompass and, if possible, to establish entity. Existence, or man, in the demagogic jargon, seems to be both universal, the essence common to all men, and specific in the sense that this universal can be neither imagined nor even conceived otherwise than in particularization, in its distinct individuality. Before all cognitive critique, however, in the simplest reflection on the concept of man in intentiona ricta, this eureka will lose its evidential character. We cannot say what man is. Man today is a function, unfree, regressing behind whatever is ascribed to him as invariant, except perhaps for the defenselessness and neediness in which some anthropologies wallow. He drags along with him as his social heritage the mutilations inflicted upon him over thousands of years. To decipher the human essence by the way it is now would sabotage its possibility. A so-called historical anthropology would scarcely serve any longer. It would indeed include evolution and conditioning, but it would attribute them to the subjects. It would abstract from the dehumanization that has made the subjects what they are, and that continues to be tolerated under the name of a qualitas humana. The more concrete the form in which anthropology appears, the more deceptive will it come to be, and the more indifferent to whatever in man is not at all due to him, as the subject, but to the subjectifying process that has paralleled the historic subject formation since time immemorial. That man is open as an empty thesis, advanced, rarely without an invidious side glance at the animal, by an anthropology that has arrived. It is a thesis that would pass off its own indefiniteness, its felicement, as its definite and positive side. Existence is a moment. It is not the whole it was conceived against, the whole from which, severed. It sees the unfulfillable pretension of entirety as soon as it styled itself philosophy. That we cannot tell what man is does not establish a peculiarly majestic anthropology. It vetoes any anthropology that seen in itself ontological, while Kierkegaard nominalistically plays off existence against essence. As a wagon of theology against metaphysics, he does lend to existence in the sense of the immediate individual a symbolic character, if only in accordance with the dogma of the person as created in God's image. He polemicizes against ontology, but the attributes of ontology are absorbed by entity, by that individual. In the realm of Dasein, the exaltation of existence in being and time differs little from that in the initial reflections of the sickness and death. Consciousness. Kierkegaard's transparency of the subject is the legal authority for ontologizing existence, that kind of being towards which Dasein can comport itself in one way or another, and always does comport itself somehow. We call existence. 20 or literally, Dasein, is in itself ontological because existence is thus determinative for it. 21. The concept of subjectivity oscillates no less than that of being, so it can be attunable to the concept of being. Its ambiguity permits Heidegger to equate Dasein with a mode of being to be, and it lets him remove the ontological difference by analysis. Dasein is then called ontical by virtue of its spatial-temporal individuation, and ontological as the logos. The dubious part of Heidegger's inference from Dasein to being is the simultaneity implied in his talk of a multiple precedence of Dasein before all other entity. The subject is determined by consciousness, but that part of it from which consciousness cannot be split is not, for that reason, fully conscious as well. It is not transparent and ontological. In fact, nothing but propositions could be ontological. The conscious individual whose consciousness would not exist without him, remains in space and time, a factuality, an entity. He is not being. In being, since it is a concept, no immediate datum, lies something of the subject, but in the subject lies the individual human consciousness, and thus something ontical. That this entity can think is not enough to strip it of its definition as an entity, as if it were directly essential. It is precisely not in itself that it is ontological, for selfhood postulates the very onticality that is eliminated in the doctrine of ontological precedence, the nominalistic aspect. But criticism is not only due to the fact that the ontological concept of existence extirpates the non-conceptual by exalting it into a concept. There is also the positional value which the non-conceptual moment conquers in the concept. Nominalism, one of the roots of the existential philosophy of the Protestant Kierkegaard, gave Heidegger's ontology the attractiveness of the non-speculative. Just as the concept of existence is a false conceptualization of existing things, the complementary precedence which these things are given over the concept allows the ontological concept of existence to profit in turn. If the individual is a socially transmitted phenomenon, so is his form of theoretical epistemological reflection. It is unfathomable why my individual consciousness should take precedence over anything else. By using the pronoun my, the speaker of the moment presupposes a linguistic generality he would deny by the primacy of his particularization. What turns for him into a basis of necessity is the pure accident of having to start with his consciousness, with the consciousness he happens to have grown into. And yet, as Hegel recognized quite early, the relation to the other, which the limitation to my is intended to exclude, is implied in the limitation. Society precedes the subject. That the subject mistakes itself for an antecedent of society is its necessary delusion, a mere negative statement about society. In the word my, the proprietary relationship has been perpetuated in language, has all but turned into a logical form, without the universal element to which this my points by setting itself apart from it. The pure is as abstract as the universal which the isolated brands empty and void. What Kierkegaard's philosophical personalism, and perhaps Buber's distillate of it as well, sensed in nominalism was the latent chant for metaphysics, but where consistent enlighteners absolutize nominalism, instead of dialectically penetrating the nominalist thesis too, they recoil into mythology. Their philosophy becomes mythology at the point where, believing in some ultimate datum, they cut reflection short. To break off reflection, to take a positivist pride in his own naivete, is nothing else but thoughtless, stubbornly conceptualized self-preservation. Existence authoritarian, the concept of existential things. Heidegger prefers the already ontologized noun existentialia. Dasein qua being, is governed by the idea that the measure of truth is not its objectivity, of whichever kind, but the pure being that way and acting that way of the thinker. The subjective reason of the positivists is ennobled by divesting it of its rational element. Jaspers goes right along with Kierkegaard in this respect. The objectivist Heidegger would scarcely subscribe to the proposition that subjectivity is truth, and yet the analysis of existentialia in being and time has distinct overtones of that proposition. Contributing to its German popularity is the combination of radical bearing and sacred tone with a personality, directed ideology of genuineness and grit, qualities which individuals in the spirit of privilege have the doltish cunning to reserve to themselves. If subjectivity by its very nature, which Kant called functional, dissolves the preordained solid substances, its ontological affirmation dispels the fear of those substances. Subjectivity, the functional concept, becomes the one absolute solid, as already outlined, by the way, in Kant's doctrine of transcendental unity. But truth, the constellation of subject and object in which both penetrate each other, can no more be reduced to subjectivity than to that being whose dialectical relation to subjectivity Heidegger tends to blur. What is true in the subject unfolds in relation to that which it is not, by no means in a boastful affirmation of the way it is. Hegel knew this, but it bothers the recristinative schools. If truth were indeed subjectivity, if a thought were nothing but a repetition of the subject, the thought would be null and void. The existential exaltation of the subject eliminates, for the subject's sake, what might become clear to the subject. It thus falls prey to the relativism to which it is deemed superior, and it brings the subject down to an opaque accidentality. The exponent of such an irrational existentialism will throw out his chest and agitate against the intellectuals by confessing that he is one, too, but the philosopher will brave a sea of talk that knows no objective dividing line between genuine, originally philosophical parlance and empty intellectualism. While the man of science always has universally valid criteria for his results and derives his satisfaction from their inescapable validity, the philosopher has nothing but the averse objective criterion of his own being to tell empty talk from the talk that will awaken existence. The ethos of theoretical endeavors in the sciences and in philosophy is radically different. 22 Devoid of its otherness, of what it renders extraneous. An existence which thus proclaims itself the criterion of thought will validate its mere decrees in authoritarian style, as in political practice a dictator validates the ideology of the day. The reduction of thought to the thinkers halts the progress of thought. It brings to a standstill what thought would need to be thought, and what subjectivity would need to live in. As the solid ground of truth, subjectivity is reified. In the ring of the old-fashioned word personality all this was heard already. Thinking becomes what the thinker has been from the start. It becomes a tautology, a regressive form of consciousness. The utopian potential of thought would be, rather, to be conveyed by reason as embodied in the individual subjects, and to break through the narrowness of that other thinking. The best energy of thought is to outstrip the feeble and fallible thinker. This energy is paralyzed, since Kierkegaard, to obscurantist ends, by the existential truth concept. Absurdity is advertised as the strength for truth, which is why the existence cult thrives in the backwoods of all countries' historicality. Ontology has long shared the resistance to idealism which the concept of existence used to offer. Entity, once called upon to bear witness against the sanctity of the man-made idea, has been equipped with the far more ambitious sanctity of being itself. This ether ennobles it from the outset, as compared with the conditions of material existence, the kind which the Kierkegaard of the present age meant when he confronted the idea with existence. What happens when the concept of existence is absorbed in being? Indeed, what happens as soon as it is philosophically processed into a general concept fit for discussion, is another spiriting away of history, which Kierkegaard, who did not take it in view of the left-wing Hegelians, had introduced into speculation under the theological sign of a paradox, the fusion of time and eternity, the ambivalence of the doctrine of being, the fact that it deals with entity and at the same time ontologizes it, in other words, deprives it of all its non-conceptuality by resorting to its characteristica formalis. This ambivalence also determines the doctrine's relation to history. On the one hand, when history is transposed into the existential of historicality, the salt of the historical will lose its savor. By this transposition, the claim of all prima philosophia to be a doctrine of invariance is extended to the variables. Historicality immobilizes history in the unhistorical realm, heedless of the historical conditions that govern the inner composition and constellation of subject and object. This, then, permits the verdict about only an entity which, in its being, is essentially futural so that it is free for its death and can let itself be thrown back upon its factical lair by shattering itself against death. That is to say, only an entity which, as futural, is equiprimordially in the process of having been, can, by handing down to itself the possibility it has inherited, take over its own thrownness and be in the moment of vision for its time. Only authentic temporality which is at the same time finite, makes possible something like fate. That is to say, authentic historicality. Heidegger, Being in Time, trans. John Macquarie and Edward Robinson, page 437. The linguistic form of fundamental ontology convicts it of a historical and social moment which in turn could not again be reduced to the pure essential of historicality. The language-critical findings in the jargon of authenticity are therefore arguments against the philosophical content. The random nature dragged along in Heidegger's draft concept, a direct legacy of phenomenology since its transition to a material discipline, grows flagrant in the results. Heidegger's specific definitions of Dasein and existence, the things he attributes to sociology, as happened to psychology before, under Husserl. Sociology is distorted into a relativism extraneous to the thing itself and held to endure the solid work of thinking, as if real history were not stored up in the core of each possible object of cognition, as if every cognition that seriously resists reification did not bring the petrified things in flux and precisely thus make us aware of history. On the other hand, the ontologization of history permits one without a glance to attribute the power of being to historical powers, and thus to justify submission to historical situations as though it were commanded by being itself. This aspect of Heidegger's view of history has been stressed by Karl Lewith, that history can be ignored or deified, depending on the human condition and views as the key to a true doctrine of being. These are not stringent, as he assumes, but deformed by accidental private factors. The false tone drowns that out and, by the same token, admits it. The quotation marks in which Heidegger frames its time in the above excerpts are presumably to indicate that what he is here referring to is not a random commitment to a contemporary today momentarily thrust upon us, but the decisive time of a genuine instant whose decisive character results from the difference between vulgar and existential time and history. Yet how can we tell unequivocally in a given case whether the time of decision is a primordial moment or just an obtrusive today in the course of world events? A resolve that does not know what it has resolved upon cannot answer this question. It has happened more than once that very resolute men would commit themselves to a cause that claimed to be fateful and decisive and yet was vulgar and not worth the sacrifice. How, in the framework of thoroughly historical thinking, should one be able at all to draw the line between authentic events and those that happen vulgarly, and to make an unequivocal distinction between man's self, chosen fate and the unchosen vicissitudes that befall him and lure him into momentary choices and decisions? And has not vulgar history avenged itself clearly enough for Heidegger's contempt of today's mere presence at hand, when it induced him at a vulgarly decisive moment to assume the presidency of the University of Freiburg under Hitler, to transform his resolute Almost Dasein into a German Dasein and to practice the ontological theory of existential historicality on the ontical ground of really historical, that is, political events? Karl Lewith, Heidegger, Denker and Dürftiger Zeit, Göttingen 1953, page 49. Circumstances is a practicable political conclusion from the philosophy of being. Time itself, and thus transiency, is both absolutized and transfigured as eternal by the existential ontological drafts. The concept of existence as the essentiality of transience, the temporality of temporal things, keeps existence away by naming it. Once treated as the title of a phenomenological problem, existence is integrated. This is the latest type of philosophical solace, the type of mythical euphemism, a falsely resurrected faith that one might break the spell of nature by soothingly copying it. Existential thinking crawls into the cave of a long-past mimesis. In the process it is nonetheless accommodating the most fatal prejudice from the philosophical history which it has laid off like a superfluous employee. The Platonic prejudice that the imperishable must be the good, which is to say no more than that in permanent warfare the stronger is always right. Yet if Plato's pedagogy cultivated martial virtues, the gorgeous dialogue still made these virtues answerable to the highest idea, to the idea of justice. In the dock and sky of the existence doctrine, however, no star is shining anymore. Existence is sanctified without the sanctifying factor of the eternal idea in which entity was to share, or by which it was to be conditioned. Nothing remains but the naked affirmation of what is anyway, the affirmation of power. Part 2. Negative dialectics, concept and categories. The indissoluble